Chapter 8 of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. The Conquest of Persia, 331 through 330 B.C. In June or July of 331 B.C., after an 11 days' march, Alexander arrived at Thapsacus on the Euphrates. Darius had assembled an army half as large again as his former vast force. Wild Bactrians, Scythians, Indians, Syrians, Cappadocians, and other faraway peoples had flocked across mountain, desert, and river to Babylon at the summons of the great king, and 1,000,000 foot soldiers and 40,000 horse soldiers filled the plain of Mesopotamia. When he heard of Alexander's approach, Darius sent the brave Masius to prevent him from crossing the Euphrates, and to ravage the country so that the Macedonians could not proceed by the direct route to Babylon, a way it was also improbable that they would take on account of the heat. He himself passed with his army over the Tigris and sought for a favorable battlefield. This he found at Gaugamela, a village on the river Bumotis, now the Gazir, near the city of Arbela, Erbel, famous in history as the place where he and Alexander fought their last fight for the possession of Asia. The battle, 1st of October 331 B.C., is often called Arbela, but more correctly Gaugamela. The scene was a vast plain, unbroken by tree or ravine, and Darius, remembering Issus, leveled to the ground any slight eminences. Alexander had sent a force to make a bridge over the Euphrates. It was not quite completed on account of Masius' presence on the other side, but at the appearance of Alexander, Masius and his 3,000 cavalry fled. Alexander passed over, and after a few days' rest, hastened across Mesopotamia, reduced by Masius to a wilderness of fire and ashes, to the Tigris, Dijla, the great river of the east, known to the Hebrews and Persians as the Arrow, on account of its swiftness. Nineveh, long in ruins, stood on its banks, and centuries later Baghdad was to rise lower down the stream. There was no one to resist the Macedonians crossing, but they had great difficulty in finding a ford, and then the water was so deep as to reach to the horses' heads, and the current so strong that horse and rider were nearly swept away, while their packages were whirled down the stream. It was a hard moment for the men when they saw their cherished booty diminishing on the racing river and disappearing in its waters. Alexander led the infantry at this critical moment, and motioned in a manner that there was no disobeying for them to hold their armor above their heads and let all else go, pointing out the route with his hand, and his voice could not carry over the whole force. Menelaus of the loud war cry would have been useful at this crisis. Had Darius appeared, one wonders what had become of the Macedonian army. The soldiers seemed to have felt very dismal after their crossing, and as an eclipse of the moon followed, 20th September 331 B.C., they were entirely disheartened. Alexander, to cheer them, offered sacrifices to the sun, the moon, and to the earth, whose doing it was, and the omens in the sacrifices were declared to be most propitious. The real cause of the eclipse was known to the king, who had carried away some Egyptian astrologers, the astronomers of his time, in his train, but he did not attempt to explain the phenomenon to the crowd, who would probably have thought the explanation impious. The army then turned south toward Babylon, with the Tigris on the right-hand side. As it proceeded toward the plain of Gaugamela, the wife of Darius, a delicately bred woman, little fitted for these hard journeys, died, and the sorrow of the conqueror and the splendid funeral he gave her can hardly have been of much comfort to old Sisygambis and the high-spirited Persian children who were now eating the bitter bread of captivity. A eunuch escaped to make the heart of Darius still heavier by telling him the news. A panic, of which the cause has never been discovered, seized the Macedonian army at this point, and Alexander was forced to give the soldiers time for rest, and exercise all his wits to restore their courage. At last he succeeded, and the camp was broken up. Masius, who watched them from a neighboring height, fled at their approach to warn Darius, and the Macedonians, occupying the summit he had left, looked eagerly out to see the Persian army congregated in the plain below. A thick mist at first hid the immense multitude, but its noise filled their ears, and even the royal heart of Alexander misgave him. Then the mist cleared, and the myriads of the enemy came clearly into view, and miraculously enough, as the soldiers of the Iliad would have thought, Ares himself, bane of mortals, filled every Macedonian heart with longing for battle. The Macedonians gave great shouts, which the Persian host returned, until the distant forests and mountains re-echoed with horrible war cries, the neighing of battle steeds and the clanging of armor. At this crisis of his life, Alexander appears to have hesitated for the first time as to his course of action. He expressed himself as doubtful in the council of generals, and took Parmenio's advice as to reconnoitering the ground, to see if the enemy had laid any traps. Parmenio said boldly that a fight by daylight was out of the question. The soldiers must not be terrified by the view of the numbers of the enemy. They had faced the great king at Issus, but the great king could not deploy his forces in a mountain defile. Here he could surround the Macedonians at his ease. The Macedonians must take him by surprise at night. Nearly all the generals applauded, but the king replied with what seemed childish folly to these old men who did not yet know his depth. He had probably learned through his excellent intelligence department that Darius expected a night attack, and that morning would find him weary with watching. Secondly, a night attack was a risky thing. Who knew what panic might not fall on his own troops, fighting the strange tribes of the east by the wild light of the campfires, and in a district which the enemy knew far better than they. Lastly, the moral effect of a victory in the light of day would be infinitely greater than that of a stolen victory. It was with all his weight behind his words that Alexander answered in the grand manner, "I steal no victory." The generals shrugged their shoulders, but the king's laconism roused a better fighting spirit than any amount of unfolding of policy would have done. Thus, while the Persian army kept vigil in the plain, shining afar with lights and fires, Darius and his officers going from watch to watch to see that all was well, and invoking the aid of Ormuzd, the Macedonian soldiers were ordered to repose. Aristander and the king sacrificed to Zeus, Athena, and victory, and Alexander was some time before he could compose his mind to slumber, but he finally sank into a profound sleep. His generals came at sunrise to receive their orders, and were surprised to find sleeping him who generally roused the camp. They even suspected that he desired to avoid the combat, and depression fell on all. At last Parmenio was forced to wake him, and even reproached his master. Alexander, however, rose fresh as the morn. He explained his deep sleep by his freedom from care now that he had no longer to chase Darius. Calling for his cuirass, which he only bore in important engagements, he soon appeared at the head of his army, and never had his face so shone with gaiety. The scythed chariot seemed from a distance to be the most formidable part of the great king's preparations, and Alexander prescribed similar tactics to those employed against the barbarians' wagons 4 years before in the ship Capas. When the chariots, drawn by swift war steeds, wheeled in among their ranks, the soldiers were to open if possible, and let them pass through. If not possible, they were to frighten the horses by their cries, and stop their advance with flights of arrows. The Indians had furnished Darius with about 15 elephants, now first heard of in the history of warfare. Not only were these mighty beasts formidable combatants, but their smell caused such terror to horses that they were much used against cavalry. The Macedonian line was extended to the utmost, so as to prevent outflanking, and a special force was placed in the rear to guard against that great danger. Alexander's army numbered about 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. As usual, he commanded the right wing, where were the cavalry companions under Clytus, Parmenio the left, with the cavalry of the Thessalians and Greek allies, while the phalanx was in the center, with the archers on the wings and in the second array in the rear. Darius sat on a raised seat in his chariot in the center of the army, according to the Persian custom. Round him were his kinsmen and the Persian guards, carrying spears with golden apples at the butt end, Indians, Albanians, Carians, and Martian archers. Beyond them stretched Ushians, Babylonians, Citizanians, Armenians, Cappadocians, and Greek mercenaries, the Greeks this time stationed in the van, in 2 divisions, one on each side of Darius and the Persian contingent. For once Alexander had no stream to cross before the enemy's eyes. After his inspection of the force opposite him, He moved to the right, and the Persians followed, moving to their left. The king continued this maneuver until Darius had been nearly drawn away from his prepared battlefield, and advanced cavalry to prevent Alexander moving farther. A general cavalry engagement followed, in which the Macedonians suffered severely from the Scythians, but at last broke the enemy's line. Meanwhile, the chariots had been directed against the phalanx, and for a while their size mowed down and mutilated the Macedonians. The Macedonians in some cases seized the horses, while their archers directed fatal showers of missiles against steeds and charioteers, but also succeeded, as they had been ordered, in opening their ranks and letting these eastern engines of war roll through, to be thereupon overpowered in the rear. The much-feared Persian chariot did a negligible amount of damage. Parmenio, with characteristic fussiness, sent to inform Alexander that his baggage was in danger, and Alexander impatiently replied, "Tell Parmenio that if we conquer we shall recover our possessions, and seize the enemies. No one must be taken from the battle for this purpose, and bid him forget such unworthy things, and fight as becomes so distinguished a Macedonian soldier." The Persians, therefore, were left with a free hand at the baggage, slew the guards, and set the prisoners free. They found Sisygambis, to whom they announced the joyful news that Darius had won a great victory. They failed, however, to deceive the old woman, or in any way to rouse her. She listened in silence with immobile countenance, and refused to leave the Macedonian camp. Perhaps some instinct of the horrible fate awaiting the last of the royal house of the Achaemenids may have possessed her. When Alexander had at last made a break in the front line of the Persians, he formed a wedge of the companion cavalry and the bristling phalanx, and led it into the gap. The charioteer of Darius was slain, and the battle became a carnage. Alexander had tired out several horses, and was fighting like Heracles, smiting down those who resisted him and those who turned their backs to fly. Darius himself fled with the first, this time in clear cowardice, as he left the way to Babylon open to the invader. The great majority of his host followed him. Hidden in the cloud of dust they raised, by the shouting and cracking of whips alone could the Macedonians tell which way the great king's guard had passed. A far more pitiable fate awaited Darius than death upon the field. Parmenio vexed Alexander again by sending for aid just when the king was anxious to follow after Darius, for much would have been spared the army if this had been the end of the chase. Maesius, on the Persian right wing, had been threatening the Thessalian cavalry with destruction, but lost hope and fell back when he saw the flight of Darius. The spirits of the Thessalian cavalry revived, and they were eager to pursue, but Parmenio restrained them, and Maesius escaped with a few of his men to Babylon. Alexander appeared in time to slay the greater number in the hottest engagement of the day. While Parmenio took possession of the Persian camp, Alexander advanced to the river Lycus, now the great Zab, a tributary of the Tigris, threw the multitude of the dead and the wounded abandoned in the flight. The losses of Darius were estimated at 300,000. After allowing his men to rest until midnight, Alexander made a forced march to Arbela, 69 miles from the battlefield, and here, though he captured the treasure of Darius with his chariot, spear, and bow, he did not succeed in finding the great king. The Macedonians were soon driven away from this neighborhood by the smell from the battlefield, where vultures and dogs were disposing of the Persian dead. Darius fled neither to Babylon nor Susa, but northward through the mountains to Armenia, to Media, there hoping to gather a fresh force. He meditated, in the philosophical way of a Persian, that wealth and prosperity had a corrupting effect on human character, and accepted his lot with a characteristic resignation of the East. Alexander did not follow. The way to Babylon was open, and thither he and his army eagerly advanced. Maesius, his son, and other magnates came forth to surrender it, and Alexander peacefully entered into the city of Semiramis, Bel, and Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonians even decked his way with flowers and garlands, and made rich gifts, and Alexander here also was able to take up the position of liberator from the alien Persian. There is nothing to show that the yoke of Persia had been particularly hard upon her subject peoples. The tribute she levied was not heavy, and life was so good in Babylon, for instance, that the Jews were unwilling to return to their country, when Cyrus ended the captivity. Yet Persia was hated, and the chief reason for this, besides the natural love of freedom, was that Persia had never been polite to native deities. Alexander never erred in this way. He commanded the temples destroyed by Xerxes in Babylon to be rebuilt, and paid his respects to Bel, the Baal of Scripture, spending an enormous amount in the restoration of his temple, for which the labor of 10,000 workmen was required. He also appointed the Persian Mazius as a reward for his submission, satrap of Babylonia. In Babylon, Alexander kept up royal state. He and his army were amazed at this immense city with its palaces and its 100 gates. Before the Persian conquest, the wall, one of the 7 wonders of the world, had enclosed an area 4 times the extent of London, and was 300 feet high, with lofty towers rising still higher all around its circumference, and we are told 28 yards wide. This wall had gone, apparently pulled down by the Persian conquerors, but there still remained the inner wall, itself of remarkable loftiness, and of such width that on the top, among the towers which rose all around it, the picturesque quadrigae of the ancients could pass each other. The swift Euphrates ran between pleasant embankments through the city, the 2 parts of which were united by a bridge, accounted a miracle of engineering skill. And above the river, round an ancient palace, rose the famous hanging gardens of Semiramis. In this city, adorned by the old Babylonian kings with so many marvels, the Macedonian soldiers who had conquered all Asia rested from their labors and took their pleasure, the fearful inhabitants eager to gratify their least whim, and Alexander anxious to let them see that so much fighting and weariness was worth while. 5 weeks were spent in this way, while he was waiting for the arrival of fresh troops. Then he made a 20 days' march to the capital, Susa, the Shushan of the Book of Esther, on the river Coaspes, a stream famous for its sweet water. Here he found the principal Persian treasure house, containing 50,000 talents, a sum equivalent to from $50 to $100 million. Objects brought from Greece by Xerxes came into his possession, and he sat at last upon the throne of Darius, a proud moment for Greeks if they could have accepted Alexander's work. It was a bitter moment for loyal Persians, and for the captive queen mother and royal children. Alexander, seeing them droop more and more each day, recommended weaving as a distraction to Sisygambes and the princesses, as he remembered how much it occupied his mother and female relatives at home. But their tears fell thick and fast at this insult to their noble birth, and he had great difficulty in assuring them of the kindness of his intention. He could not consider himself free to follow Darius until he had visited the old center of Persian power, Persepolis, the town built by Cyrus. He had to fight his way into Persia proper, for the passes which led from the plain of Mesopotamia into the highlands of Persia were held by the warlike Ushians, who would not let the great king himself pass without payment. They hurled down missiles on the conqueror's army, and after he had chased them away he had to face Ariobarzanes, the royal satrap of Persis, at the head of 40,000 infantry and 700 cavalry in the Persian gates. Ariobarzanes had entrenched his men behind a wall which he had caused to be built across the pass, and awaited Alexander as the Thessalians had awaited him at Tempe 6 years before. Now, as then, Alexander circumvented the enemy. A Lycian prisoner, who had been a shepherd in these parts, led part of the army in the night by a forest track known only to the herdsmen, while Craterus remained with the rest of the army to deceive the enemy. It was a rough, precipitous track, snow fell, and a bitter wind stung the Macedonians, who began at length to doubt the Lycians' purpose. And it was after memorable hardships that when morning dawned, the little army burst forth on the enemy at the head of the pass and took it unawares. Craters swarmed up from the plain, and a terrible carnage took place on both sides. The king, in this January of 330 B.C., received news that Persepolis was to be pillaged. To prevent its wealth falling into Macedonian hands, and leaving his infantry, he dashed forward with his cavalry, marched all night, and arrived at the Araxes at daybreak. By the destruction of several hamlets, the materials were obtained for a bridge, and Alexander hastened on. As he approached Persepolis, A large body of captive Greeks was allowed to come out to meet him, and they were a sight to inspire terrible revenge in their fellow countrymen's breasts. They were mutilated in the most horrible way, no longer possessing human faces, and nearly all refused Alexander's offer to send them back to Greece, where they knew they could only shock their old friends. They at least saw in Alexander an avenger sent by Zeus, and the king did all he could to make them happy in this outlying part of his empire. On the day following, Alexander entered the city from which the troops of Darius the Great and Xerxes had set forth to conquer Greece, and it was found to surpass even Babylon and Susa in the treasure it contained. Camels, it is said, had to be fetched from those places to carry away all the wealth, 120,000 talents, in the public treasury. Stories now utterly discredited tell us that for a while the king allowed free massacre and pillage, but Persepolis had made no opposition to him, and even as he had to be severe where a city was held against him, so it would have been fatal to his career of conquest if he had slaughtered those who surrendered. The Macedonians feasted and revelled in Persepolis as in Babylon, and Dryden has described the great revel and bonfire with which their visit closed. At Alexander's feast, the young king and his war-worn officers lay listening with varying emotions to the musician Timotheus. War, he sang, is toil and trouble, honor but an empty bubble, never-ending, still beginning, fighting still and still destroying. If the world be worth thy winning, think, oh think, if worth enjoying. Lovely Thais sits beside thee, take the gifts the gods provide thee. Whatever the actual temper of the Macedonian army, never has the mood of soldiery in an hour of relaxation been better caught than by Dryden. The poet continues, much on the lines of the legend, that at last the mighty master smote the chord of vengeance. The king, stirred to madness, rose and grasped a flambeau. Thais with a torch led the way, and the palace of the kings of Persia, built of cedar wood, was soon flaring in the night sky. Others believe that this was no outrage of the wine-cup, but a calculated and impressive act. The Persian invasions had been the deed of the great kings, not of their subjects, and Alexander emphasized this fact by the symbol he chose for destruction. He took no vengeance on Asia, now his own kingdom. Somewhat sobered by their outburst of frenzy, the Macedonians went on their way. Their king was now the great king, and it only remained to find his dispossessed rival. They sought him at Ecbatana, the capital of Media, where he had been residing since Gaugamela. But he had fled northward to the Caspian Gates, meaning to lay waste Parthia and Hyrcania and hide in Bactria. Alexander stayed some time in Ecbatana, which was the summer residence of the Persian kings. Its palace was adorned with capitals and entablatures of gold and silver, and with silver tiles and wainscotings, and the city, with its strong citadel and 7 walls, seemed to him a fitting place to make his treasury. Here he left the Persian hoard, amounting to nearly £500 million of English money in value, in charge of his childhood's friend Harpalus, who was to prove too weak for such a gigantic trust. The king sent home from Ecbatana all the soldiers of the Greek allies who wished to leave him, but retained, with or without its will, his own national levy. The dismissal of the allies made no constitutional difference to his presidency over Hellas. Parmenio was left with a large portion of the army to attend to various affairs in Media, and then marched through Cappadocia to Hyrcania, while Alexander and his force pushed on after Darius. He made such speed that horses and men fell by the way, and on the 11th day he arrived at Rake, near Taran, a day's march from the Caspian Gates, only to find that Darius had passed through. After 5 days' rest, Alexander left Media, now a part of his empire, and marched by the Caspian Gates into Parthia, a state of little importance in his time. As news arrived that the Persian nobles under Bessus, satrap of the rich province of Bactria, had revolted against Darius and put him in chains, he pressed forward at a still more mad rate, taking with him only the companions and a few picked infantry, marching the whole night until noon the next day, and the whole of the second night, until he found a cold campfire, where he had expected to find the Persians. He learned that the Greek mercenaries and a few Persians had remained faithful to Darius, but powerless to protect him from Bessus, had left him. Despite the most fearful fatigue, Alexander hastened on, riding all night and until noon next day, when he came to Thara, the Parthian village where Bessus had encamped the day before. He learned that the enemy also was fleeing night and day, and determined to try a short cut through the desert, leaving the infantry to follow by the route Bessus had taken. Before daybreak he came upon the Persians, unarmed and defenseless. Stabbing the hapless Darius, whom they were conveying in a covered carriage, Bessus and his companions left him and fled, and the train of pursuers passed by. His horses dragged the great king away from the roadside, and, deserted by every friend and servant, he died. There was a story of a courteous dying message to Alexander delivered to the Greeks who found him. Alexander, when he came up, threw a cloak in pity over the body of this king, robbed of his purple robe and lying dead in the dust in a condition sad enough for a beggar. Like Croesus, Darius had experienced the utmost from the mutability of fortune, and like Cyrus, Alexander showed respect to fallen greatness, rendering every honor to his dead rival's corpse. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Alexander in Central Asia, 330 through 327 BC. Alexander was now lord of the empires which had belonged to the Assyrians and Babylonians, Lydians and Medes, not yet of the whole extent of the Persian Empire. The Persians had extended the Median realm over valley, desert, and mountain to the faraway Jaxartes, now the Daria. To that stream Alexander also marched, and the reduction of this district was to take him a disproportionate amount of time. Having hunted down the Martians in their lairs in hill and forest, and forced them by terrible threats to restore Bucephalus, which they had stolen, he advanced to Zarakarta, the capital of Hyrcania, situated on the southern shore of the Caspian Sea. Here Persian magnates and their suites poured in to do homage to their new sovereign, and the Greek mercenaries, who had remained faithful to Darius but would not serve under Bessus, sent offers of surrender. Bessus, it appeared, had assumed the style of great king. Alexander was about to enter Bactria when news of Persian risings compelled him to dash southward into Arrhaea and Drangiana. At Propthasia, the capital of Drangiana, the growing discontent of the army received its first reply from the king. A rumor that Alexander meant to return home had caused such joy while they were in Hyrcania that Alexander had been seriously alarmed. But his eloquent reproaches had rendered officers and men again anxious to follow him wherever he wanted to go. He, moreover, drew a picture of all the newly conquered nations rising and attacking them if they retreated, and of Bessus becoming sovereign in his place. For a while the impression of this speech lasted, but the Macedonians had other causes of uneasiness, and it is said that Alexander's inspection of his subjects' correspondence left him in no doubt about their opinions of himself and his actions. Alexander seemed to consider the simple ways of the old kings of his race now unworthy of him, and had begun to imitate the state of the monarch he had dispossessed. He encouraged Macedonians who addressed him to prostrate themselves in the Asiatic way, and soon he accustomed the generals who had conquered so many peoples to render him what the Macedonians considered menial services. The first ruler in antiquity to lay aside distinctions of race to such an extent, Alexander placed Persian officials, whom his men thought it was leniency not to slay, over nearly all the provinces of Asia. Worse than all, he assumed on state occasions and expected those about him to wear Asiatic dress, a purple vest, loose scarlet trousers, and a purple robe, a white mixture in the vest being a royal prerogative, as was the wearing of the tiara erect. He even used the seal of Darius for Asiatic business. To men of a later age these seemed the deeds of one who was both a statesman and a cosmopolitan born out of his time. But the Greeks so despised the Asiatics that they were outraged and scandalized. The old soldiers cried out that they had lost more than they had gained by their victories, since they were turned into slaves. Also, tales are told of the terrible debauches by which Alexander saddened the Macedonian soldiery, and the readiness of Asiatic royalties to take life seemed to have come to him with the garb they had worn. Now at Prothesia, a plot was formed against his life, and led to the execution of Philotas, son of Parmenio, who was worshipped by the army. Brave, tireless, and munificent, the common soldiery had probably adored him all the more for his haughtiness, but he had become hated among his equals, and his father had once said to him, "My son, to be not quite so great would be better." He had once spoken presumptuously to the king, who had never forgiven it. Alexander had questioned him as to what the oracle at Siwa had said to him, and having, like everybody else, questioned the priest as to Alexander's deity, he replied that Zeus was sorry for men who had to obey one who considered himself more than a man. When a young officer who had got to know of the plot went to the royal tent to inform the king, Philotas came out, and the young man thought it quite sufficient to warn this great officer. Was not Parmenio the king's chief general, and had not his other sons, Hector and Nicanor, died in the royal service? Philotas commended him, and re-entered the tent, where he conversed alone with the king for a long time, but mentioned no word of the conspiracy. The young officer waited for a day or two, and then informed some other courtier, and the news was at once carried to the king, together with the story of Philotas's suspicious conduct. Alexander wept bitterly, and after an interview with Philotas, summoned a council, to which Philotas was not admitted. Craterus, to whom Alexander gave his chief trust, took up the brief against Philotas and urged his death. On the following day the soldiers were assembled as a court-martial, for in peace the Macedonian people had the right to try Macedonians in capital cases, and in war this power belonged to the army. The king disclosed the plot against his life, and his auditors listened in tears and anger, and when he told them that Parmenio was at its head, and Philotas was its chief instrument, a great murmur of indignation rose. When, however, depositions were taken, and Philotas appeared in no way incriminated, silence succeeded to the murmuring. Philotas was brought forward in bonds, and Alexander left the court. Having determined on his death, he did not wish to hear his justification of himself. The strongest point in Philotas's defense was that he and Parmenio had before carried such information to the king, as in the case of their suspicion of Philip, and been mocked for their pains. The enemies of Philotas were busy haranguing the crowd, this impressionable crowd of uneducated soldiers, and at last the old soldiers of this famous cavalry general called for his blood. Hephaestion, Craterus, and Coinus, who were all to rise on the ruins of the house of Parmenio, superintended his torture, and for long neither groan nor confession was wrung from him. But in the end he cried out that he and Parmenio had been maturing a plot against Alexander ever since they left Egypt. He was utterly broken down by the torture, and Alexander, concealed behind a tapestry hanging, called forth in his wrath, "Are you so mean-spirited and effeminate, Philotas, and yet can engage in so desperate a design?" He and all the others convicted by the depositions were then slain by the Macedonians with their javelins. After Philotas was dead, the army had a reaction. They remembered the debt of gratitude which Alexander owed to the aged Parmenio, who had now lost all his sons. The king, however, sealed and dispatched Parmenio's death warrant. He must surely have been convinced of Parmenio's guilt, for he was wise enough to know that a faithful servant of Parmenio's gifts was priceless. He may, however, have feared from Parmenio effectual opposition to his wider plans, as he appears to have snatched at the opportunity of getting rid of him. It is difficult to believe that he was simply wrought upon by the enemies and rivals of this house. When the head of Parmenio was brought into the camp, a commotion in the army was with difficulty repressed. The deed was a milestone in Alexander's career. Not only did the nations tremble at his name, but his own people became fearful under the king's eye. He adopted Persian methods of mutilating captives of a certain degree of guilt, and his frown, like those of sultans gone and sultans to come, spelt death. From this time we may picture him in his oriental costume, like some caliph of Eastern story. Hephaestion and the king's foster uncle, Clytus, received joint command of the companion cavalry, over which Philotas had been sole ruler, and Ptolemy took the place of another fallen suspect, Demetrius, in the bodyguards. Alexander appointed a governor of Gedrosia, Baluchistan, in the south, and in the spring of 329 B.C. marched, fighting, through southern Afghanistan, Arachosia. He founded a city of Alexandria in this province. Physical features have so changed in Afghanistan and India that it is in vain to try and identify most of the places mentioned in Alexander's story. But this Alexandria may have been corrupted into Kandahar. The Hindu Kush was known to the ancients as the Paropamisus, the Himalayas as the Imaeus, and with the Pamirs the whole system was called the Indian Caucasus, associated in Greek legend with the sufferings of Prometheus and the childhood of Dionysus. At the foot of the Hindu Kush, Alexander founded another city of Alexandria. In the spring of 328 B.C., he led his army over the heights of the Hindu Kush, possibly by the Kawak Pass, a task from which Heracles might have shrunk. The very Promethean rock was pointed out, and the Macedonians were now in a position to sympathize with the god who had suffered so much to give humanity the great blessing of fire. Many of them lost limbs or life with cold, and the rest ate herbs and mountain sheep or slew their horses. Bessus was laying waste the country beyond them, and Alexander pushed on despite snow and ice. Below lay the beautiful province of Bactria with its plentiful fruit trees and fields of corn and meadows, now part of Afghanistan. But the Macedonian army had to march through the desert track of its western border, and here suffered terribly from drought and heat. And Alexander's heart misgave him as he saw the condition of his troops. He, at least, took more than his share of the toil of the march, and refused to drink when no water could be got for others, and he sent back to Macedonia and Greece the oldest Macedonians and the Thessalians. When Alexander approached the Yellow Oxus, the boundary between Bactria and Sogdiana, now Bokhara and Turkestan, Bessus fled across the stream, burning his boats, and after conquering Aornus and Bactra, the Bactrian capital, Alexander prepared to follow him. The Oxus, best known to most of us as the scene of Matthew Arnold's Sohrab and Rostrum, entered the Caspian, not the Aral Sea in Alexander's time. It was the broadest stream which the Macedonians had yet had to cross, and it took 5 days to convey the army over in primitive boats of hides stuffed with straw, native skiffs like those in which Alexander had crossed the Danube. In Sogdiana, the frontier province of the Persian Empire, Alexander carried out an even more far-fetched vengeance than at Persepolis. A century and a half ago, the Bronchidae of Miletus had given to Xerxes the treasures of the temple of Apollo to aid him in his invasion of Greece, and pitiable indeed would have been the fate of these traitors if the Greeks of their own time could have got hold of them. Xerxes therefore settled them in the farthest province of the realm, where no Persian thought that any of their fellow countrymen would ever come till the world's end. There their descendants still lived, unmixed with the natives, and speaking Greek. Strangers in a strange eastern land, they received the Macedonians with rapture. They cannot have dreamed that the sins of their fathers would have been visited upon them after this lapse of time, and Alexander committed a crime for which no excuse of any sort can be made, by slaying them and razing their city to the ground. Alexander had lost more men in his march through northeast Persia than in many of his battles, and he had now come to the Jaxartes, which was to be the northeastern frontier of his, as of the Persian Empire. On its southern bank, commanding the route to northern Persia and the pass over the Tian Shan Mountains, by which southeastern Europe had communication with China, he built Alexander the Ultimate, on the site of the modern Koshan. As he was planning this town, he heard of the rising of Sogdiana behind him, and immediately turned back. The inhabitants sought refuge in their 7 cities. In 2 days 5 of these fell, and at 2 of them all the male inhabitants were slain, while the women and children and other booty were carried to the Macedonian tents. At the largest of the 7, Syropolis, the frontier city founded by Cyrus, Alexander brought up his military engines to batter down the high wall. But noticing that the bed of the river, which flowed through the town, was dry, he determined to creep into the town by its means in the night. All the Sogdian soldiery were engaged on the walls when he entered with a picked force by this route, and the city was in his hands before the garrison was aware of his presence. Still they made a valiant resistance, and it was only through lack of water that the citadel was surrendered on the following day. Both Alexander and Craterus were wounded. After the capture of the 7 towns, Alexander returned to the Jaxartes, and in 20 days fortified his new city, which he peopled with natives, Greek mercenaries, and worn-out Macedonians. From the opposite bank, a gathering of Scythians, it is thought that this may have been the first emergence of the Turk in history, defied him, as the Getae had done on the Danube, and Alexander crossed for a military demonstration, here as there. He ordered skin boats to be prepared, and despite his feebleness from his last wound, and Aristander's warning that the omens were unfavorable, passed over and scattered the barbarians, chiefly by means of his archers. The excellent field artillery, a new thing in the history of war, protected the army as it was rowed across. The heat was so terrific that the king did not follow the flying foe. He drank some of the same sort of water that the natives drink to their detriment today, and on which the Western traveler hardly dares to look, and fell dangerously ill. Hearing, however, of a fresh rising and of Macedonian disasters, he rose and laid waste to Sogdiana. Alexander spent the winter of 328-27 B.C. in Bactria and Sogdiana, but failed in Hellenizing this typical eastern country. Indeed, he merely permanently weakened brave and warlike peoples, so that the nomad Magyars and Turks from the desert steppes north of the Oxus found no difficulty in overrunning it later, and it passed from hand to hand until Russia annexed the greater part in the 19th century. Sogdiana is, for the most part, a desolate region of desert, steppe, snow-capped mountain, and glacier, but between it and Bactria runs the life-giving stream of the Zarafshan, the strewer of gold, with the beautiful cities of Samarkand and Bokhara, so rich in medieval memories on its banks. Afrosiab, adjoining Samarkand on the east of that fair Moslem city, is the site of the Markananda of Alexander the Great's travels. Bessus fell into Alexander's hands this winter. He had won the dislike of his fellow traders, and in fact they could fly no farther. Scythia was no home for luxurious Persians. They therefore sought to save their own skins by surrendering Bessus, who received what ingenuity of punishment a king could devise for one who had been traitor to a king. Finally, according to one account, his nose and ears cut off, he was taken to Ecbatana to die on the cross. Commanders and men were worn out by the labors and hardships of the last few years, and Alexander showed the effects of the strain. He was too purposeful to be often merry, but he became increasingly grim and forbidding, and he felt deeply the chasm between him and his friends. Hephaestion alone followed him cheerfully in his policy of conciliating Asiatic peoples to his rule by adopting their habits and customs, and he could trust few beyond him to deal with Asiatics. Craterus, whom he respected more than Hephaestion, clung to his old Macedonian ways, and Alexander said that Craterus was the king's friend, Hephaestion the friend of Alexander. On his part he showed ideal tolerance for their weaknesses. Hagnon wore silver nails in his shoes. Leonatus employed several camels to bring him powder out of Egypt for use when he wrestled. The dead Philotas used to have hunting nets 100 furlongs in length. Most of them used precious ointment instead of oil after the bath. He pardoned their various smallnesses, avarice, and folly, but would sometimes chide them for avoiding all bodily labor, saying that it was both noble and royal, and when they were not fighting he organized great hunting expeditions, so that sloth might not corrupt his Macedonians, who were now lords of many slaves. Now, amid the magic peace of Marakanda, Alexander still further darkened his shadowed life by the murder of his old friend Clytus. He and his courtiers sat late at a drinking party, and the king was listening in approval, and by his own confession and drunkenness, to who was praising him at the expense of Castor and Pollux, while someone was witty about the officers who had been defeated by the Sogdianians. Alexander was blind to the anger brewing among the older men, who, however, sought to calm down Clitus, ill-advised to choose this moment to flout the king. He told them that he owed all his glory to his soldiers, and taunted him with the fact that he had saved his life at the Granicus, although he pretended to be son of Ammon. And above all the clamor that burst out over his head, he shouted that if free men might not speak their minds, Alexander had better live and converse with barbarians and slaves who would not scruple to bow the knee to his Persian girdle and his white tunic. Alexander, unable any longer to restrain his rage, threw at him one of the apples that lay on the table, and looked about for his sword. Someone had hidden it, and others tried to hold him, while he called aloud in the Macedonian dialect, which he only used when very perturbed, for his guard. The trumpeter dared to neglect the order, and friends forced Clitus out of the room. Clitus, however, rushed back, and lifting the curtain hanging over another exit, cried out a bitter line from Euripides. Snatching a spear from one of the soldiers standing near, Alexander hurled it at the curtain, and Clitus gave a cry and fell dead. The king came suddenly to himself, and saw the table where a short space before they had been carousing and laughing, his companions looking at him with white, startled faces, and lying dead in the doorway, his old foster mother's brother, Clitus. Seizing the pike with which he had slain Clitus, he sought to take his own life, of which he suddenly sickened, but his guards prevented him, and for 3 days he lay moaning and refusing food, calling ever on Clitus and Lanus, and saying he had made a noble reward for all her care in rearing him, since she had lived to see her sons die fighting in his behalf, and her brother slain by his hand. At last he put away his grief, and dreaming Maracanda, it was easy to persuade him that this thing, like all others, was appointed by the gods, and a sophist was found to teach him that the king, being the fountain of justice, can do no wrong. Alexander's deepest conviction about this affair came to be that he was not responsible for his own action. He had been incited to crime by a god. Like Orestes, he was hunted for a while by the Erinyes, and they sat evermore on his threshold, waiting to avenge. He had now twice tasted the blood of his friends, and at Bactra, Callisthenes, the Olynthian, Aristotle's nephew, who had followed Alexander in order to chronicle his deeds, fell into disgrace. He seems to have treated Alexander to the same sort of snub which Solon dealt out to Croesus, and Alexander in these days was little likely to enjoy it. Aristotle had said of Callisthenes that he was an excellent speaker, but had no judgment. There was a great deal of nobility in his character, and he died for a worthy cause, the right of free speech and action in an Asiatic court such as Alexander's had become. He was ardently opposed to the custom of prostration, and at a wine party where the subject was specially brought up by Alexander, he made an impassioned speech against it. At the close of the feast, Alexander drank the health of the circle of guests, and handed the golden goblet first to those who were in sympathy with him in the attempt about to be made. They drank, prostrated themselves, and received a kiss from the king. Persian and Macedonian followed each other until it came to the turn of Callisthenes, who drank, summoned up his courage, and did not prostrate himself. The king thereupon refused him the kiss, and he left the feast, saying lightly, "I have but lost a kiss." The occasion chosen to destroy this churlish courtier was the conspiracy of the pages. The corps of pages was a school of generals, and several boys who were to be kings after Alexander's death were then of this band, and they had determined to murder Alexander because he had caused one of their number to be whipped. There seems to have been no evidence against Callisthenes, who was charged with inciting them and put to death. The king seems to absorb the new lesson of Maracanda that he was fountain of justice, and that all his deeds were consequently just. There had been much in Callisthenes' conversation to enrage him. He was very sore at the talk against him in Athens, and at this time he even vaguely threatened Callisthenes' kinsman, his own old teacher Aristotle. Alexander was again forced to cross the Oxus, but after some more hard fighting, the last opposition sank. In the spring of 327 B.C., he captured the Sogdian rock, from the dizzy heights, 18,000 feet, of which the defenders called jeeringly to ask him if he could fly. Choosing 100 men who had been mountain shepherds, he offered rewards of from 1 to 10 talents to the first 10 to reach the top, and otherwise incited their valor. They climbed the rock in the most precipitous and therefore unguarded place, in the night, fixing their iron tent pegs in the earth or hard frozen snow as they mounted, and tying strong ropes to the pegs. 30 perished in the climb, and buried in the snow were never seen again. The rest reached the summit at dawn, and managed to stand and wave their white linen flags to the king watching anxiously below. The barbarians gathered round them and imagined that they had indeed some arrangement for flying, and in their fear and amazement surrendered. Alexander, to whom the terms Greek and barbarian were becoming more and more mere words, married Roxanne, the beautiful daughter of the Bactrian chief, Oxyates, by the simple Macedonian ceremony of slicing a loaf and eating one half while she ate the other. Oxyates' influence in this marriage reconciled the Sogdianians and Bactrians to the rule of the foreigner, and Alexander might at length leave the district. The head of the last rebellious chieftain was brought into the camp by his wife, whom Alexander caused to be driven away in disgrace. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. The Conquest of the Punjab, 327 through 326 B.C. Perhaps owing to his early death, Alexander left no abiding impression on Turkestan or Afghanistan, and now he was going to do an equally ephemeral work in India. It is only fair to remember that he would have known how to control this conquered territory, and that had he left a son of full age, Macedonia might have remained the head of the wealthiest empire the world has ever seen. East and West, had Alexander lived, would have been united in the bonds of trade as they were under the Romans, while eastern countries that never bowed to the Roman came under the yoke of the Macedonian. In the light of actual events, however, all Alexander's labors beyond the Euphrates seemed vain. In the late spring of 327 B.C., this little western torrent rolled out of Afghanistan, and with its accretions made for a country even more alien than Sogdiana to the land where it took its rise. Indian sages were trying to discourage Alexander by telling him that every man possessed as much of the earth as he stepped on, and that in the end he possessed no more than he could lie down upon. Alexander set forth more like a sultan than a Greek king. He contented himself with an army of 120,000 men, at the most exaggerated computation, and probably only half that number. But the most gorgeous raiment was worn, and the horses were trapped with gold and silver. The Greeks knew nothing of India, but believed that the Indians surpassed the Persians in magnificence, hence probably the show. The proud soldiers must almost have all been in Eastern dress by this time, since their Macedonian clothes were long ago in rags. Crossing the Hindu Kush by the Kawak and Quaushan passes, Alexander advanced to the Kabul, then the Koban, and sent a herald to Omphis, known to the Greeks as Taxiles, from the country he governed, and to other chiefs dwelling on the farther side of the Indus, bidding them submit to the Lord of the world. Taxiles at once offered submission, and remained on Alexander's side throughout his sojourn in India. He and some other chiefs wished for Alexander's aid against the great Indian chief, Porus, of whom we shall hear later. And they did very well for themselves by aiding the Macedonian. Alexander was 1 or 2 days' journey from the Khyber Pass, by which Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, and so many other foreign conquerors were to descend in future ages into the rich valleys of India. But it is thought this pass was not used in Alexander's time. He divided his army and sent half forward under Hephaestion and Perdiccas to fight its way up the Kabul valley, across the mountains, and prepare a bridge for his crossing of the Indus. Many months were spent by the remaining force in this wild district in fighting even more desperate than that in Sogdiana and Bactria, before Alexander was ready for the entry into India. He, as well as Ptolemy and Leonatus, were several times wounded, despite the fact that whole villages were destroyed in order to daunt the ardor of the warlike inhabitants. Once he had encamped in a forest near the city of Nysa, now lost, in the Suwad, bordering the slopes of the Kohi Moor, and on account of the cold, huge fires were made. These cedarwood monuments of the Nysaena dead in the forest caught fire, the flames spread, and the distant glare woke the citizens to the knowledge that the enemy was at their gates. Nothing could have saved them had not the Macedonians, to whom Dionysus was most dear, learned the name of their city. Dionysus had been hidden in the thigh of Zeus on a mountain which he named Nysa, after his nurse, and on Mount Meros, thigh, now Kohi Moor, nearby, the Macedonians found the god's sacred vine and ivory. The war-worn soldiery, ever emotional as children, went wild in a Dionysiac frenzy. After the manner of the bacchanals of their native land, they covered themselves with ivy, crowned their heads with the vine, danced the mystic dances, and sang the sacred hymns. Those who stood by, at first wondering, quickly imitated their example, and for 10 days India saw the foreigners engaged in a ritual sympathetic to her own manners, and perhaps truly derived from her before the memory of man. Nysa was allowed to retain her independence, though it was understood that Alexander might call for a contingent of soldiers. At last all the remaining inhabitants of the district abandoned their cities and took refuge on Mount Aornus, the birdless, most probably Mahaban, near the Indus, about 7,000 feet high and 23 miles in circuit, and possessing arable land in abundance of water. There was but one means of ascent, and that a difficult one. The earlier conqueror, identified by tradition as Heracles, had found this natural citadel impregnable, and Alexander solemnly proceeded to outdo Heracles. Some of the natives offered to guide him up for a reward, and he readily offered the large sum of 80 talents. Ptolemy and a small force were sent with the guides, and established themselves where an assault could be made, building a stockade in front of them, and lighting a beacon as a signal to the king. But before Alexander could join Ptolemy, both forces were simultaneously attacked by the Indians. At last Alexander got a letter carried to Ptolemy by an Indian deserter, and managed to join forces with him, but their joint attack failed. Multitudes of trees were hewn down to make an enormous mound whence to project missiles from the military engines, and the Macedonians then captured a small eminence on a level with the citadel. As the mound approached the rock, the natives determined to retreat by stealth. They sent with offers of surrender to beg for a truce, and commenced their flight. Alexander, as usual, had intelligence of their doings, and as they deserted their citadel, he entered it, and then dispatched troops to chase the fugitives. Many were slain, and the rest perished by leaping in their panic down the precipices. We can estimate Alexander's intrepidity by remembering that portions of this country remain unsurveyed to this day on account of the fierceness of the inhabitants. By this time the bridge over the Indus was ready. Alexander and the Romans after him usually passed over wide streams by means of bridges of boats, formed by mooring a sufficient number of vessels in place by anchors of stones, lowered in wicker baskets from the prow of each vessel, and laying planks and cross-planks on them until they were firmly bound together, strong gangways being placed at each end of the bridge. When the king arrived at the Indus, the river bank was crowded with cattle and elephants sent as a gift from Taxiles, who surrendered his city, Taxila, to him. Alexander crossed the Indus, probably at Ohand, at daybreak in March 326 B.C., almost a year after his departure from Bactria. The permanent boundary of his empire he in all probability intended to be the Indus, and was now merely exploring, imagining that he was near the Eastern Ocean. But he was thwarted in his Indian schemes, and we are really ignorant as to what may have been his original aims in entering India. India, where no European traveler had ever ventured before in human record, was a great surprise to the Macedonians. They found a people blacker than any other Asiatic race, tall, simple, and frugal in habit, and more warlike than any people with whom they had come into contact. Its marvels of vegetation, its brilliantly colored birds and strange beasts, threw them into amazement, and the tropical rains through which they had to march for their first battle in the Punjab plunged these hardened veterans into the deepest misery. Taxila is probably commemorated by the vast ruins near Rapalpindi, a city which was a famous center of Hindu culture. Alexander rested and held sacrifices and games, and then left a garrison there to hold the Indus. From the Indus, the army marched in the sultry April weather to the Hydaspes, Jhelum, the next great river of the Punjab. Here its further progress was opposed by the heroic king Porus, who ruled from the Hydaspes to the Asines, Chenab, the district of which Lahore is now the center. Porus was, we are assured, 4 cubits and a span high, and mounted upon an elephant of the largest size, appeared to have as suitable a mount as another man upon a horse. He stood on the farther brink of the Hydaspes with a force of foot soldiers and cavalry not half so large as that of the Macedonians, but possessing a large number of chariots and a host of loudly roaring elephants. All the fords of the stream were guarded by his troops, and never had Alexander met a braver, more determined, or more skilful foe. On the other hand, an Indian prince, however brave and skilled, was predestined to fall before a master of every sort of warfare, and expert in stratagem like Alexander. The latter sat down as to wait for the subsidence of the stream, swollen with incessant rains, and at the same time made a pretense of night surprises. For many nights Porus, hearing noises and seeing moving lights on the farther bank, kept his men in readiness for battle. But as night after night nothing happened, he ceased to take notice of these alarms. This was Alexander's aim. He had perceived at a bend in the Hydaspes, about 17 miles from his camp, a projecting headland covered by a dense grove, with a well-wooded island in front. Here he determined to cross, while at the same time a feigned attempt at crossing was to be made by Craterus from the camp. Under certain conjunctures, Craterus was really to cross, with Perdiccas, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and other generals, the companions and a picked force of infantry. Alexander made a secret march at night, going for some way inland, and returning to the stream at the chosen place of crossing, where an extemporized fleet was collected. A furious thunderstorm and the heavy rain aided the attempt, and the army was not perceived by the sentinels of Porus until it was beyond the island. They flew off on the long ride to Porus, but the Macedonian had time to complete his crossing and draw up his army. His boat was the first to touch land, but he soon discovered to his dismay that he was not on the mainland but on another island, and it was some time before the ford was found. The stream was so high with the rains that only the heads of the infantry and horses were to be seen above the water, and as he climbed up the slippery shore, Alexander is reported to have cried, "O Athenians, would you believe what dangers I incurred to merit your praise?" He might have made such a speech at the Granicus, but hardly now, although he may have hoped that when his schemes were one day perfected, Aristotle would at last understand that they were great, and wonder, like all the world, at the man who had the strength to carry them out. Directly after the Macedonians' landing, the son of Porus rode up with a hastily gathered force, but was repulsed and slain. The news was borne to Porus, who was torn with doubt as to the fitting course to take. Opposite him was Craterus, seemingly prepared to cross. Above was Alexander, slaying his subjects. He determined to take the risk of leaving Craterus opposed by a small force, with a few elephants which he thought would prevent his crossing. When he came to a fitting battleground, he halted and drew up his forces, placing in front, as he saw that the Macedonian horse was approaching, a line of 200 elephants, standing 100 feet apart, to frighten the horses. Behind and beyond the elephants he placed infantry, flanking the infantry with cavalry. The chariots arranged in front of the cavalry on each side were of no use on account of the muddy ground. When Alexander heard the tambours and saw this novel array, He waited for his infantry to come up, but wished it, despite the elephants, to be a cavalry battle, and Porus was unable to prevent his making it so. Alexander himself led the cavalry charge against the enemy's left front, while he sent Conus round to attack the same force in the rear. The Indian left had to face both ways, and speedily fell into confusion. They fled for shelter behind the elephants, who stood solid and massive like towers in a wall. The elephant drivers sought to urge their beasts against the Macedonian cavalry. The phalanx intervened, and the animals made fearful inroads into their serried ranks, raising the combatants with their trunks and handing them to the Indians. The Macedonians, however, with axes and swords, chopped at their trunks and limbs, and at last, mad with the pain of arrows and spears, the huge creatures began to trample underfoot friend and foe. They injured the Indians more than the Macedonians, until those which had not been slain began to back out of the battle, facing the enemy and uttering a shrill, pathetic piping sound. Alexander then surrounded the foe with his cavalry, and at his order the phalanx, with linked shields, pressed the Indians back, and cut down all who did not succeed in flying through the gaps between the masses of cavalry. When Craterus perceived that Alexander was winning, he brought over the rest of the army, and his fresh troops slaughtered the flying foe. Rarely had the soldiers inflicted such carnage, and among the 20-odd thousand Indians lying in the thick mud round their dead elephants and broken chariots were 2 sons of Porus. Porus, richly armed and accoutred, still sat a gigantic figure on his great elephant. He had fought on until all were slain or fled, and now, having received a new wound, turned his beast about to depart from a lost field. Alexander sent Taxiles to bring the king to him, but he tried to slay this old foe. Alexander, moved with admiration, took some pains to get the valiant chief to return, sending his friend Meroeus, and at last Porus rode slowly back, while Alexander came out to the front to meet him and admire at close quarters his handsome figure and lofty stature. Porus greeted him as one brave man would another, and when Alexander asked him how he expected to be used, he answered, as a king, a reply which struck the strongest chord in Alexander's breast. Not only was he magnanimous enough to confirm Porus in his rule, but he added to his territories. Thus he fought the great battle of the Hydaspes in June or July 326 B.C. 2 cities were founded near each other, one Nicaea, victory, now Mung, where the battle took place, south of the Kari plain, the other Bucephala, on the opposite bank of the Hydaspes, in memory of Bucephalus, who died at this point, worn out with age and toil. Bucephala became a great city, and has been identified with the modern Jalum, where an ancient road terminates in an ancient ferry. Somewhere Alexander founded a city to the memory of his dog Peritus. After a month's halt on the shores of the Hydaspes for rest, games, and sacrifices, Alexander left Craterus to superintend the building of the new cities, and went on his way across the Punjab. Populous towns and large villages surrendered as he approached. He crossed the Essecines at a point where it was nearly 2 miles wide, and as tempestuous as a mountain torrent. Those who went over in skins had an easy passage, but many of those who went in wooden boats perished, as the skiffs were dashed to pieces on the rocks. Porus, nephew of the defeated king, was still in revolt, and Hephaestion was sent after him, while Alexander went over the Hydraotis, Ravi, where he had much trouble with the Cathaeans and other tribes. The city of Sangala, which stood on a hill, was protected by a triple palisade of wagons and a large force of Indians. The Indians mounted on the wagons and shot at Alexander's cavalry as it advanced, and Alexander saw that it was not suitable warfare for this arm, so he dismounted and led the phalanx against the wagons. After a hard struggle he captured the palisade and besieged the city. At night a flight took place as he expected, and he cut to pieces the small party that left the city. Then he formed a double stockade, surrounding Sangala except at one point where there was a lake, and at the open part he placed a strong guard. He was preparing his battery engines when a deserter told him that a second attempt at flight was to be made on the following night at the lake. Here Ptolemy was accordingly stationed, with orders to give the signal if anything happened. In the middle of the night the gates were opened, and the Indians stole out. Ptolemy blew his bugle, and drove them back with great slaughter, while the army partly threw down, partly scaled the wall. In the fight Lysimachus was wounded, and many other officers were slain. The city was razed to the ground by the Macedonians. Still the king pressed on, and now came to the river Hyphasis, the Bahus. But here the over-wearied army refused to march farther. In vain Alexander represented that the distance from the Ganges and the eastern sea was not great, and pleaded with his soldiers to follow him onward. Glorious, he told them, in the eloquent way that he had so often nerved them in the moment of danger, and inspired them to bear extraordinary hardships. Glorious are the deeds of those who undergo labor and run the risk of danger, and it is delightful to live a life of valor and to die leaving behind immortal glory. All their conquests were thrown away if they went back now. He and his soldiers had shared their toil and danger, and also their rewards, and when they had traversed the whole of Asia, he himself would lead them back to Macedonia, giving them gifts to exceed their hopes. And he concluded, thinking of his colonies, "Those who remain here I will make objects of envy to those who go back." For once the king's harangue left the army unmoved. A long silence followed, for the soldiers dared not speak. Several times he asked the opposition to express its views, and at length Conus, after an artful preamble, thus stated the case: "O king, you see yourself how many Macedonians and Greeks started with you, and how few of us are left. Of our number you did well to send back the Thessalians, because you saw that they were no longer in the mind for new labors. Of the other Greeks, some have been settled as colonists in the cities which you have founded, and not all of them remain there of their own free will. The Macedonian soldiers and the other Greeks who still continued to share our labors and dangers have either perished in battle, become unfit for war on account of their wounds, or been left behind in different parts of Asia. The majority, however, have perished from disease, so that few are left out of many, and these few are no longer so vigorous in body as of old, while they are still more exhausted in spirit. All those whose parents still survive feel a great yearning to see them once more. They feel a longing for their wives and children, and for their native land itself, surely pardonable with the honor and dignity they have acquired from you, returning as great men, whereas they departed small, and as rich men instead of being poor. Do not lead us now against our will, for you will no longer find us the same men. Let the king carry to the home of his fathers these victories, so many and so great, and then set forth afresh with fresh young troops, and go to the uttermost parts of the earth." At this cheering broke forth, and the more broken down of the old troops wept as Conus touched on their wretched condition. Weak voices prayed Alexander as their king, chieftain, and father, to lead the army back to Macedonia. Alexander, annoyed at his general's freedom of speech, but more at the temper of the troops, dismissed the conference, and on the following day played his last card. He announced that he was going on, that he did not intend to insist on their accompanying him, and that those who wished were at liberty to go back and say in Macedonia that they had left their king alone among his enemies. Then he retired to his tent, where he remained until the third day, not admitting even the companions, and expecting hourly the submission of the army. He was to receive it in similar circumstances later at Opus, but at this time the soldiery simply awaited his reappearance in silence and resentment. At last the king reappeared. He must have resolved to go back, but he caused the auspices to be taken for the crossing of the river. They were said to be evil. An announcement was made to the army that, as the gods were unfavorable to further progress, the king had decided to return. A shout of joy rose from the radiant troops. They rushed in crowds to the royal tent and blessed Alexander because he, the unconquered, had allowed himself to be conquered by them. It was one of the bitterest moments in his life, but he showed no sign. As a jest or an advertisement, Alexander caused enormous camps to be traced, with gigantic beds for men and preposterous mangers for horses, when he left the Hyphasis, in order that stories might grow up in India of the visit of some giant race. Still the king pressed on, and now came to the river Hyphasis, the Bias, and 12 great altars were erected, and sacrifices made to the 12 Olympians. The Macedonians bade a solemn farewell to this far-away Indian stream, and Alexander, having rounded the goal of his course, turned westward in September 326 B.C., from a land to which he was never to return with the fresh young troops suggested by Conus. 3 more years and this restless life was to be over. It is of some interest to the idle to speculate on what would have happened had Alexander continued his onward march. What would have happened to the king? And what would have happened to his Western Empire? Would he have lived if he had not gone back to Babylon? End of Chapter 10. Section 11. The Return to Susa, 326 through 324 B.C. The Alexandrian Empire was now sketched out as far as extent went, and Alexander turned his marvelous energies for the short remaining portion of his life to its organization, although vast schemes of commercial expansion and geographical discovery were on the stocks when he died. The cities he established were from the first as much trading centers as garrisons, and were probably intended by him to be so. When he finally returned to Pella, if he ever intended to return to that unattractive spot after seeing so many wonderful cities, the richest of the East were to roll naturally into Macedonia through the conduits he was laying down. Western commerce with India was for the first time to be possible, and Alexander was about to make a determined effort to circumnavigate Africa when he died. His decision to avoid wearisome land marches for his army by sea voyages must have led in itself to the acquirement of new geographical knowledge. He was also building a fleet for exploration of the Caspian. By the side of schemes like these, the picture of his ignorant soldiers struggling along under the sacks of booty which were, to them, all that war meant, is a pitiable one. But king and common soldier fared much the same in the long run. The king passed away with all his schemes unfinished, and the men either lost their booty on the way, or perished before arriving home with it. Porus was made viceroy of the country as far as the Hyphasis. The Hydrotes and Essenes were recrossed by the army, rejoicing in the thought that in a few months' time all their labors would be over, and they might settle down as rich and famous men for life. On the shore of the Essenes, Conus fell ill and died, and the monarch, who buried him magnificently in his usual way, could not refrain from saying that the return toward Macedonia for which Conus had pleaded had not done him much good. Nor did Alexander intend the army to march home by the quickest route. Besides dragging part of the force through the wilds of Gedrosia, it is thought that he meant to lead the army home to Macedonia via Syria, Egypt, Africa, Spain, and Italy, and there were signs that for himself he intended to make Susa his permanent capital. At the Hydaspes, Alexander stayed some time to superintend affairs at his 2 new cities and prepare for the heroic expedition, which was to prove one of the heaviest labors of the long-suffering army. Men of his time speculated, as modern men have speculated, about the sources of the Nile, and Alexander must have thought that river of extraordinary extent, as he at first imagined that the Indus was the same stream. The natives, however, told him that the Hydaspes and Essenes united and joined the Indus, which then flowed southward and formed a delta at its issue into the ocean. He also learned for the first time that by traversing this ocean westward, keeping near the coast, vessels would arrive at the mouths of the Euphrates and Tigris, which did not unite at that time, whence it was a short march to Susa. The king had never seen the ocean, and like every other Greek had heard plentiful stories of its perils, the chief of which were its supernatural horrors. Nevertheless, there opened before his mind's eye the vast possibilities of ocean travel, and he caused this new route to be explored. The whole army went southward toward the ocean, down the Hydaspes and on its banks. With its barbarian accretions, it was now a huge force. Craterus rode along the right bank of the stream at the head of one contingent, Hephaestion on the left bank at the head of another with 200 elephants, while the fleet, amounting to nearly 2,000 craft, was under Nearchus. Onesicrates, who wrote an unreliable account of the king's travels, being pilot of the royal ship. At the approach of dawn on an October day in 326 B.C., as the last troops were embarking, Alexander offered sacrifices to the rivers Hydaspes, Asinus, and Indus, to Poseidon, Amphitrite, the Nereids, and Ocean, as well as to Zeus, Amnon, and Heracles. When he had embarked, he poured out a libation to the river deities from a golden goblet, and ordered the signal for starting seaward to be given by the trumpet. The Indians accompanied the army for a considerable distance along the banks of the stream, dancing and singing their native songs. The cries of the boatswains and the splash of the oars reverberated long after the last Macedonian boat had passed out of sight down the river. At the juncture of the Hydaspes with the Asinus, several vessels were wrecked by the roaring, dashing waves, and Alexander might have felt that he had fought with these streams as Achilles had striven with the Scamander. When the fleet had again reached calm water, the king went on an island expedition against the Malians and nearly lost his life in a moment of reckless valor. He marched 60 miles through waterless country, captured the chief city, and slaughtered all the inhabitants, while Perdiccas took another town from which the barbarians had fled. Then, chasing the fugitives before them, the soldiers sped on to the Hierotis, forded it, and rushed onward, slaying, till they came to a stronghold of the Brahmins and drove its defenders from their walls. As the Indians withdrew into their citadel, a few Macedonians rushed in with them, but fought their way out again. Alexander then brought up his siege engines and ordered scaling ladders to be placed against the walls of the citadel. He himself was the first man to leap down among the enemy. The soldiers quickly followed, and nearly the entire body of defenders, about 5,000, were slain. Other sieges and battles followed. In one day, Alexander, again the first to mount a scaling ladder when besieging a Malian stronghold, was left alone with Fucestus, Abrahas, and Leonatus, through the ladder breaking with the weight of climbers beneath. Aloft in his glittering armor, a mark for every missile, there seemed to be only one thing for the king to do, and that was to slip down among his friends as they called him to do. Instead, he leaped suddenly down over the wall into the hostile city. It was magnificent, but was it war? It seems almost impertinent to put such a question to such a warrior, but his army did not hesitate to ask it when they had got him safely out again. They seem, indeed, to have feared that he had become indifferent to life, for in their remonstrance they laid the greatest stress on his responsibilities. Meanwhile, like some mythical Norse hero, Alexander was fighting below, single-handed against a host. A tree, as he had no doubt calculated before leaping down, gave him a certain amount of cover. The Indians thronged round him, eager to dispatch the dragon that had devoured Asia, but he slew those who approached. They were forced to draw back, and from a distance threw missiles. Thus he stood with his back to the wall, surrounded by a little heap of corpses, when the three who had climbed up behind him sprang down to his assistance. Abrahas was instantly transfixed by an arrow and fell dead, and Alexander was now pierced through the breastplate. He fought on, though dizzy with loss of blood, until he fell swooning over his shield. Then Paeocestus leaped in front of him, holding him over the sacred shield brought from Troy, while Leonatus guarded him on the other side. Both were wounded, and still no help came. The Macedonians outside were so eager to get up to help their king that all the ladders were broken, and they only mounted in the end by driving pegs into the wall or climbing in stages on each other's shoulders. When at last they leaped down on the inside, a loud cry of lamentation rose, for they saw their king lying on the ground as though dying. A desperate conflict followed around his fallen body, till the city gate was forced and the whole body of soldiery poured into the town. While some bore off the king on his shield, others turned to the congenial work of revenge, and not a man, woman, or child in that city escaped death. When the arrow was removed from the king's wound, after an operation borne with Spartan fortitude, he bled copiously and swooned again, and it was some time before he was sufficiently recovered to return to his fleet and army at the juncture of the Hierotis and the Aesinus, where Nearchus and Hephaestion exercised their respective rules. A report had been carried that he was dead, and after the first lamentations for their beloved leader, these soldiers were struck with fear and contemplating their own position without Alexander in the midst of hostile nations. There was no one of Alexander's generals whom they thought for a moment of comparing with the king, and they may have shrewdly guessed that men like Hephaestion and Craterus, already bitter rivals, would have gone to war with each other rather than have accepted the other's superiority. Their direst forebodings at this time were fulfilled less than 3 years later, when Alexander actually died. A letter from the king arrived at the camp, but it was believed to be a forgery, and Alexander, hearing of all that was going on, and fearing a revolution, rose from his sickbed. He was carried to the Hydrotis and placed in a boat. The oars were muffled, as he was too ill to bear their noise, and the usual cries of the boatmen were silenced in the long, slow journey down the Hydrotis to the Aesinus. As he approached the camp, the tent covering was removed so that the army might see the sick king with its own eyes. But the soldiers were incredulous, believing that Alexander's corpse was being brought to them, until they saw his hand feebly waving. Then a great cheer rose from the crowd, and many wept. A litter was brought, but ill as he was, Alexander was lifted onto a horse and rode amid shouts of joy toward his tent. At the entrance he dismounted, so that he might be seen walking, and the men crowded round him. Some touched his hands or knees or clothes to be quite sure that he was really there and alive, while others threw the garlands and flowers of India. Afterward, severely chidden for his wanton recklessness, an old Boeotian replied for him, to the tune set by both Alexander and his father, in a line from Aeschylus: "Who does must suffer." Neighboring nations, including the Malians, now sent in their submission. Sailing down the Aesinus to its junction with the Indus, Alexander there founded another great city of Alexandria, with a large dockyard, and created a new province stretching from this point to the coast. Another Alexandria with another dockyard was founded as he sailed down the Indus to the sea. He sent Craterus with the worn-out soldiers to march back to Persis by the Bolan Pass and Sistan, and then spent some time in reducing the cities and sovereigns of Sind, again coming into conflict with the Brahmins, whom he learned to respect as deep philosophers. The scanty reports indicate a fierce resistance. Cities were razed to the ground, and their inhabitants sold into slavery. At Patala, the ancient capital of Lower Sind, near the apex of the Indus Delta, Alexander established a third great city with harbor and dockyards, for he had made a correct estimate of the wealth and importance of India. It is almost certain that he would have organized permanent trading relations between this country and the West, although he would perhaps never have found his way round by the Cape. Of that even we cannot be sure, since he usually succeeded in what other people thought to be impossible. He only reigned for 13 years, and we can never cease to wonder how far the world would have been changed had his life been of the normal span. When his third city in the new province was well on its way, he sailed down the right branch of the Indus, the Bugar, to the sea. At a certain point, natives with primitive notions informed the Macedonians that if they sailed on for 3 days, they would come to bitter water which spoiled sweet water, and thus they knew that the ocean was near. Most of the inhabitants fled far away, and Alexander could not even find a pilot, while a storm damaged nearly all his vessels. He was forced to send troops into the interior to capture some Indians to guide them out of the river, and finally the Macedonian fleet anchored in the last roadstead before the open sea. The Aegean, with its many islands and consequent cross-currents, can be as rough as the ocean, so it was not on account of its tossing that the Greeks looked forward to their coming experience with dread. Besides its supernatural terrors, the limitless character of the ocean appalled them. Moreover, as they came to the mouth of the Indus, they were alarmed by the phenomena of the tide, of which they knew nothing. The water came in and out like a living thing, softly raising the ships anchored on the mud, but doing serious damage to those on hard ground. After the first attack and retreat, soldiers were placed to give warning if it should happen again, and preparations were eventually made on the strength of the ocean's regular hours. Alexander again made solemn offerings to these gods, to whom, he said, Amen had bid him render especial honor, and sailed out to inspect and to perform his priestly duties. On the open ocean, for the first time in his life, he sacrificed to Poseidon, and cast the golden goblet and bowls used for the libation into the sea as an offering for the safety of the fleet, which he was sending thence to the Persian Gulf on an errand of discovery of the utmost importance to his future schemes, and perhaps little thought to see again. Then he returned to the shore. Nearchus, his childhood's friend, was to command the fleet, while Alexander marched along the desolate shores of the Mekron, an infinitely more foolhardy journey in modern eyes. Digging wells and leaving stores of food for the sailors at various points of the coast, Nearchus was compelled to wait for fit weather, as the southerly monsoon was then prevailing, and early in the autumn of 325 B.C., the king bade him farewell, and started on a journey that no European was to make again for over 2,000 years. Indeed, it is thought that it cannot have been quite so dreadful in Alexander's time as it is today, or his army could never have arrived alive at the other end. At first the soldiers were delighted by the myrrh trees, the odoriferous root of nard, and the exotic flowers, and another city of Alexandria was founded among the warlike Oricians. But soon the Macedonians entered a waterless waste. A few fisher folk only were met with in this desolate coast region of Gedrosia. Both Alexander and Nearchus came into contact with the Ichthyopagi, fish-eaters, who lived in huts made of mussel shells, with roofs of the backbones of fishes. A whale offered great architectural possibilities to these simple, briny people. They discovered that its jawbones made a perfect pointed doorway. Their drink was seawater filtered through gravel. The army became gradually more and more wretched, while all their king seemed to think of was catering for the fleet. They came one day to some settlement in the waste, with fields of corn standing round it, and these were harvested for Nearchus and sent with sheep and dates, all fastened together and sealed with the king's seal, to the waterside, to await the ships. So hungry were the soldiers, however, that they broke the seals and fed, nor did Alexander, when he came to hear of it, dream of punishing them, for he knew that only despair had led them to do it. No army had ever passed by this route before, unless it was that of Cyrus, said to have been destroyed in an attempt to traverse southern Gedrosa, and the legendary Semiramis had gone this way when she had fled from India. Nothing that the army had undergone before came up to its sufferings here. The heat and drought destroyed the greater part of it, and most of the beasts of burden. The scorching sand being intolerable, the marches were usually made in the night time, but owing to the scarcity of water, they were often of inordinate length, and had sometimes to be continued during the day. The soldiers in their hunger sometimes killed the beasts of burden for food, and then lied about it. Then, for lack of animals to carry them, the sick had to be abandoned on the route, and no one was left to tend them, as the safety of the whole army was at stake. Those whom they deserted cursed them as they went, and all their precious objects, one with blood, had to be dropped on the desert. When they found water, many of them drank themselves to death. Looking back in after days, this journey seemed like some terrible nightmare. It was in the Mekron that Alexander performed one of the most notably generous acts of his life, and it was seldom that he was not ready to make some generous sacrifice for a friend. He cared so much for big things that he was more ready than St. Martin to give away merely personal possessions, and would take a wonderful amount of trouble to do some little service for anybody. He was now leading his army on foot so as to encourage the infantry, and was in great distress from thirst, when some soldiers came running up with a little water which they had collected in a helmet from an exhausted spring. In the sight of the whole army, looking at him with wolfish faces, The king poured out the water on the ground, and the army felt as refreshed as though each man had received a draught of it. The whole route, however, was strewn with their dead bodies, the pest coming to the aid of hunger and thirst. One night the swelling of a brook swept away most of the women and children who followed the camp. One awful day arrived when the guides confessed that they had lost trace of the route, and Alexander made for the left without knowing how far he might be from the sea. Advancing with a few horsemen, he soon came to the coast, where he found some fresh water, and the guides were again familiar with the way. At Pura, the capital of Gedrosia, the army arrived in the late autumn of 325 B.C., and rested and refreshed itself, its fearful labours now indeed over. Here Alexander came again into touch with the West, which he had left so long ago. Viceroys and generals with their armies arrived from the various satrapies of Asia to pay their court and bring the king fresh supplies and troops. Accusations of tyranny and extortion flowed in against these viceroys, and those against whom wrongdoing was proved were put to death, for Alexander was determined that the conquered races should be contented under his rule. He heard also that one of the governors whom he had left in India had been murdered by the natives, but that the rising had been put down. Through Kirman, by a route of about 400 miles in length, the Macedonian army now proceeded in a very different fashion from that in which it had painfully crossed Gedrosia. Ptolemy and Aristobulus, the two best historians of that period, made no mention of Bacchic revelry, but tradition said that Alexander and his friends lay prone in richly bedizened coaches. The soldiery, merry with wine, like the officers, played the flute and danced along in garlands, while the towns through which this Dionysiac procession passed wore the gayest decorations. Craterus met the party, and soon they entered the home province of Persis. Susa was still 500 miles away, but the Macedonians might consider that they were back once more in the realms of civilization. In Persis, Alexander found that revolts had broken out, and the execution of a few magnates were necessary. At Pasargarte, the king was angered by the damage done to the tomb of Cyrus, whom after Achilles he honored. Guarded by magi, Cyrus lay buried in a golden coffin, with purple raiment and precious stones piled on a rich couch in the tomb, but the tomb had been pillaged, and the corpse cast out of the coffin. Torture extracted from the magi no information as to the malefactors, and Alexander was forced to content himself with commissioning Aristobulus to restore his hero's grave. He caused the old inscription to be cut again in Greek characters below the old one. It ran, "O man, whosoever thou art, and from whencesoever thou comest, for I know thou wilt come. I am Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire. Do not grudge me this little earth that covers my body." The ruins of this simple edifice are still to be seen on the plain of Punjab, where a winged effigy of Cyrus exists on one of the pillars. The viceroy of Persis was hanged, and the valiant and faithful Piusestus was made viceroy in his stead. Piusestus, even better than Hephaestion, understood and liked the Persians. He preferred the Median to the Greek dress, and spoke Persian like a native. As the king approached his capital, Harpalus, the treasurer, fled, hiring a band of 6,000 soldiers and taking with him to Greece, where he thought he would be safest from Alexander. 5,000 talents of the public money left in his charge. From Pasargadae and Persepolis, Alexander went on to Susa, where he arrived in the spring of 324 B.C. Nearchus, meanwhile, had set sail from the mouth of the Indus in October, and hugged the shore, landing at various places along the coast, and suffering severely from lack of water and provisions, but keeping in touch with Alexander, and arriving safely at the journey's end, although he narrowly escaped missing the Persian Gulf and passing out of Ken down the coast of Africa. He landed at the fertile Ormuz, Harmozea, and dirty and starving, his men were rejoicing in the fruits of the earth when they met a Greek who proved to be one of Alexander's soldiers. Nearchus and Archias, in their rags, went inland to visit the king, who could scarcely recognize them, and was overjoyed at the success of a voyage to which he attached so much importance. Among other things, he would be able to avoid many of the terrible land marches which were so costly in lives and future. He warmly commended the fleet and bade it continue its course along the Persian Gulf and up the river to Susa, a task which Nearchus successfully accomplished. End of Chapter 11. Section 12 of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. The last 2 years, 324 through 323 B.C. The city of Susa lies in the fruitful plain of Elam, bordered by low bleak hills. It was from 15 to 20 miles in circumference and rich in populace. In the columned halls of Darius, with its quaint capitals and the richly treated lotus of its enameled bricks, Alexander held his great marriage feast. At last he definitely refused to be a Macedonian conqueror, and took up the position of an Asiatic king. And in the same way as he had adopted Ammon as his father to conciliate the Egyptians, and married Roxanne to win over the Bactrians, so now he wedded Statira, also called Varsine, the eldest daughter of Darius, and would, it was to be hoped, become ancestor of a king of Asia in whom the Achaemenid blood should flow. His favorite, Hephaestion, married Statira's sister. Craterus took a daughter of Oxythrace, brother of Darius. Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Eumenes, Nearchus, Seleucus, and other companions, to the number of 80, received wives from noble Persian or Median houses. The weddings were celebrated at Susa in 324 B.C. in the Persian manner. Seats were placed in a row for the bridegrooms, and after the banquet the brides came into the hall and seated themselves, each one near her own husband. The king took his bride by the right hand and kissed her, and all the other bridegrooms followed his example. Then each led his bride away, and to each Alexander gave a dowry. 10,000 Macedonians of lower rank followed this example set them from above, married Asiatic women, and received presents from the king. Imitating Persian customs, Alexander, who had now 2 wives, married a third, Parysatis, daughter of Ochus. These mixed marriages caused no unfavorable comment in the army. On the contrary, they are said to have been the most popular thing Alexander ever instituted. At Susa, too, the soldiers who had suffered so much received splendid rewards. They had lost or squandered their booty, and a large number of them had got heavily into debt. This came to the king's ears, and he ordered that a list should be made of how much each man owed, announcing that he would pay it. At first only a few gave these unpleasant statistics, as many imagined that the king was merely trying to find out about their manner of living. When Alexander learned this fact and its reason, he reproached the army for its mistrust of him, caused tables heaped with gold to be placed in the camp, and allowed debtors to receive the amounts of their debts without registering their names. Money to the amount of 3 or 4 million pounds was distributed in this way, besides large sums now given to each soldier according to the services he had performed in the king's wars. Those who received golden chaplets for personal gallantry were Peucestus, who held the shield over Alexander when he was wounded among the Malai, and Leonatus, who had distinguished himself on that and other occasions. Nearchus, who had successfully conducted the ocean voyage. Onesicritus, the pilot of the royal ship. Hephaestion, the favorite, and the remaining bodyguards increased in number from 7 to 8 by the inclusion of Peucestus. Puffed up with pride and their pockets full of money, the Macedonians now received a severe blow. They had not understood the tendency of the marriages, never looking a yard before them. But the king's next act was clear for all to see. Alexander had realized that the Persians and Asiatics generally were not bad fighting material. He may have suspected that these long-suffering, fatalistic peoples could rise, when led by a commander like himself, to a warlike excellence that would leave even Macedonians behind. When he had left Persis in 330, he had set in hand the training of the boys of the conquered races, who were to be drilled in military discipline after the Macedonian fashion, and armed in the Macedonian way. Now 30,000 youths, the first fruits of the new system, were brought by the viceroys to swell the Macedonian army. These smart soldiers excited the jealousy of the veterans, and their wrath knew no bounds when Bactrian, Sogdian, Araean, Arakotian, Drangian, and Parthian horsemen, distinguished for stature, strength, skill, or courage, were admitted into the companion cavalry, the headquarters of the Macedonian aristocracy, and Asiatic grandees were made officers in the army on an equal footing with Macedonian officers. The Macedonians whispered that the king thought as much of the Asiatics as of his own old troops, and went about nursing their grievance, but worse was to follow. After a short stay at Susa, Alexander sent Hephaestion with the main body of the infantry by land to the Persian Gulf, and followed by river, sailing down the Euleus, the Karasu, to the sea, that stream which now enters the Shatt al-Arab, then flowing independently to the ocean. Thence he sailed along the coast of the Tigris, which he had caused to be made navigable as far as Opus. The Persians had made weirs in the stream to prevent a naval invasion, and Alexander caused them to be destroyed, calling them base precautions, a reason as childish as the one he gave for not attacking Darius by night at Gaugamela. The ease with which he demolished the precautions suggests that he deemed them a false security. He went up the Tigris as far as Opus, where he left the stream for the land journey to Ecbatana, but before striking eastward, he assembled the Macedonians and declared his intention of sending back to their homes the aged and disabled, promising to enrich them as to make them the envy and object lesson of all. The veterans must have suffered a cruel blow when they knew that they were not to march back to their homes under the king's standard, and perhaps Alexander was not surprised when those who had raised the loudest cry of home along the route now burst out into bitter reviling of him when he set them free to go, and was ready to have them conducted back to Macedonia. But besides their wish to wait for the king at this point, this seemed the final act of Macedonian supersession by Medes. "Discharge us all," the Macedonians cried in the fury of their wrath, "and go and fight with your father Ammon's help." Easily roused as Alexander had become, this speech stung him in his turn to fury. It showed how the soldiers who had accompanied him over the world misunderstood him and his position, and as they could not comprehend, so he would not allow them to question. He at once leaped down from the platform on which he stood, pointed to the chief rebels, and ordered their arrest. His guards seized the mutineers, 13 in number, who were led away to execution. A terrified silence had fallen, and Alexander, remounting the platform, made an eloquent and touching speech. His father Philip, he told them, had found the Macedonians vagabonds and destitute, most of them clad in hides, feeding a few sheep on the mountainsides, and constantly dreading the incursions of the Illyrians, Trebellians, and Thracians. Instead of hides he gave them cloaks to wear. He led them down from the mountains into the plains, instructed them in the arts of war and life, and made them rulers over the very barbarians whom they had hitherto feared. He had added the greater part of Thrace to Macedonia, seized ports and secured the gold mines to the Macedonians. He had conquered Thessaly and humbled Greece. These were the advantages which accrued to you from my father Philip, great indeed if looked at by themselves, but small if compared with those you have obtained from me. For though I inherited from my father only a few gold and silver goblets, and there were not even 60 talents in the treasury, and though I found myself charged with a debt of 500 talents owing by Philip, and I was obliged myself to borrow 800 talents in addition to these, I started from the country which could not decently support you, and forthwith laid open to you the passage of the Hellespont, though at the time the Persians held the sovereignty of the sea. Having overpowered the viceroys of Darius with my cavalry, I added to your empire the whole of Aeolus, both Phrygias and Lydia, and I took Miletus by siege. All the other places I gained by voluntary surrender, and I granted you the privilege of appropriating the wealth found in them. The riches of Egypt and Cyrene, which I acquired without fighting a battle, have come to you. Coelo-Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia are your property. Babylon, Bactra, and Susa are yours. The wealth of the Lydians, the treasures of the Persians, and the riches of the Indians are yours, and so is the external sea, You are viceroys, you are generals, you are captains. What then have I reserved to myself after all these labors, except this purple robe and all this diadem? I have appropriated nothing for myself, nor can anyone point out my treasures, except these possessions of yours or the things which I am guarding on your behalf. I feed on the same fare as you do, and I take only the same amount of sleep. Nay, I do not think that my fare is as good as that of those among you who live luxuriously. And I know that I often sit up at night to watch for you, that you may be able to sleep. But some one may say that, while you endured toil and fatigue, I have acquired these things as your leader without myself sharing the toil and fatigue. But who is there of you who knows that he has endured greater toil for me than I have for him? Come now, whoever of you has wounds, let him strip and show them, and I will show mine in turn, for there is no part of my body, in front at any rate, remaining free from wounds, nor is there any kind of weapon used either for close combat or for hurling at the enemy, the traces of which I do not bear in my person. For I have been wounded with the sword in close fight, I have been shot with arrows, and I have been struck with missiles projected from engines of war. And though ofttimes I have been hit with stones and bolts of wood for the sake of your lives, your glory, and your wealth, I am still leading you as conquerors over all the land and sea, all rivers, mountains, and plains. I have celebrated your weddings with my own, and the children of many of you will be akin to my children. Moreover, I have liquidated the debts of all those who had incurred them, without inquiring too closely for what purpose they were contracted, though you receive such high pay, and carry off so much booty whenever there is booty to be got after a siege. Many of you have golden crowns, the eternal memorials of your valor and of the honor you receive from me. Whoever has been killed has met with a glorious end, and has been honored with a splendid burial. Brazen statues of most of the slain have been erected at home, and their parents are held in honor, being released from all public service and from taxation. But no one of you has ever been killed in flight under my leadership. And now I was intending to send back those of you who are unfit for service, objects of envy to those at home. But since you all wish to depart, depart all of you. Go back and report at home that your king, Alexander, the conqueror of the Persians, Medes, Bactrians, and Sacians, the man who has subjugated the Usians, Arachosians, and Andrangians, who has also acquired the rule of the Parthians, Chorasmians, and Hyrcanians as far as the Caspian Sea, who has marched over the Caucasus, through the Caspian gates, who has crossed the rivers Oxus and Tanais, and the Indus beside, which has never been crossed by anyone else except Dionysus, who has also crossed the Hydaspes, Asines, and Hydraiotis, and who would have crossed the Hyphasis if you had not shrunk back with alarm, who has penetrated into the great sea by both the mouths of the Indus, who has marched through the desert of Gedrosia, where no one has ever before marched with an army, who on his route acquired possession of Curman and the land of the Oricians, in addition to his other conquests, his fleet having in the meantime already sailed round the coast of the sea which extends from India to Persia. Report that when you returned to Susa you deserted him and went away, handing him over to the protection of conquered foreigners. Perhaps this report of yours will be both glorious to you in the eyes of men and devout forsooth in the eyes of the gods. Depart. This speech, or the words that have come down to us in the form of this speech, was the nearest Alexander ever came to a justification of his life. At its close he leaped down quickly from the platform, and entered the palace, where he remained in seclusion as on the banks of the Hyphasis, not admitting the companions, and paying no heed to the adornment of his person. On the third day he summoned the chief Persians, and distributed the commands of the army among them. Persian kinsmen, a Persian title of special honor, a Persian foot guard, Persian foot companions, a Persian regiment of Argyraspids, Persian cavalry companions, and another cavalry regiment, were all armed in the Macedonian way. To these soldiers Alexander spoke of the recent intermarriage of Persians and Macedonians, and praised the Asiatic soldier as a brave and desirable subject. Henceforth, he said, consider yourselves members of my people, not only of my army. Asia and Europe are one in the same kingdom, and I give you Macedonian armor. I have abolished all distinctions, and you are both my citizens and my soldiers. Shades of race have been obliterated, and Macedonian may freely imitate Persian, and Persian Macedonian, for those who live under the same king ought to be under the same law. Statesmanship, tolerance, a Roman fairness of mind appear in Alexander's treatment of the subject peoples, and seem to promise a fair future to the world over which he ruled. His wars, like those of the Romans, seemed to be the inauguration of a long peace. But just when the world was ceasing to be restive under his new ruler, he was taken away, and there was no one to maintain his empire. Meanwhile, the Macedonians, too abashed to run after the king as he left the hall, were gathered, mourning at the palace gates, where they had cast down their weapons as a token of submission and supplication. Shame had fallen on them as he spoke, for they had a sudden insight into the aims of a greater nature than their own. They remembered that he had suffered far more than they had. They besought to be allowed to enter, offered to give him scapegoats, and called out that they would die if the king persisted in his resentment. For no ruler has ever inspired stronger personal attachment. When he heard his soldiers' cries, Alexander at once appeared and found them humbly prostrated on the ground, lamenting loudly, and he also wept. Their entreaties against his new arrangements drowned the words he attempted to speak, and he allowed Calenus, captain of the companion cavalry, to become their spokesman. Calenus was instructed to tell the king that the only thing that grieved them was the creation of Persian kinsmen, who had the honor of saluting Alexander with a kiss, whereas none of the Macedonians had yet received this honor. "But," interrupted Alexander, "I consider you all my kinsmen, and so from this time I shall call you." Thereupon Calenus advanced and saluted him with a kiss, and all those who wished to do so followed his example. Then they picked up their weapons and returned to the camp, shouting and singing a hymn of thanksgiving to Apollo, the god of reconciliation. Alexander made special sacrifices and gave a public banquet, where the Macedonians sat nearest to him, the Persians next, and great men of other nations afterward. The king and his guests drew wine from the same bowl, and poured out the same libations, religious matters being seen to by Greek priests and magi equally. Alexander solemnly prayed the gods to establish concord among the many nations represented under his roof, and after a paean of thanksgiving to Apollo, the 9,000 guests, drawn from nearly all the tribes of Western Asia and Eastern Europe, streamed out in friendship into the night. The disabled and outworn Macedonians returned home of their own free will, to the number of about 10,000, receiving as viaticum 1 talent each beyond their pay, and that seems to have been all, except that the king gave them a recommendation to Antipater that when they came home, at all public shows and in the theatres, they should sit in the best seats, crowned with garlands, and the children of those who had lost their lives in his service were to have their father's pay continued to them. They were not allowed to take home their Asiatic wives and children for fear of the anger of the Macedonian women. The king, to whom boys were a future army, was glad to have the chance of bringing them up in the camp, for the children of the camp always made the best soldiers, and became responsible for these children, promising to bring them to Macedonia when they grew up. It is to be hoped that this army of infants was not thrown helpless on the world at his death. Alexander kissed and wept over the departing soldiers, whom he sent home under Craterus, appointed to supersede Antipater as governor of Macedonia, Thrace, and Thessaly, and president of Greece. Antipater, who had been regent in Macedonia all this long time, had quarreled bitterly with Alexander's mother, Olympias, whom nobody could support, and perhaps Alexander thought that Antipater had enjoyed royal power at the nominal seat of empire too long. Craterus, an old-fashioned Macedonian, was well suited to the task of ruling at home, and was, moreover, no longer strong enough for the camp. Antipater was to join Alexander, bringing with him 10,000 fresh Macedonian soldiers to make up for the 10,000 sent home. On the way back, Craterus was directed to obtain a large fleet in Phoenicia for an expedition against Carthage and other Libyan powers, to raise various temples of large size, and to transplant certain European and Asiatic peoples, as Americans of our own time have dealt with the Red Indians. Craters had only got as far as Cilicia on the return journey when Alexander died, and these great schemes were never carried out. Alexander, as the Persian kings were accustomed to do, spent the late summer and autumn of 342 B.C. at Ecbatana, and took his fill of festivity. Wine parties and gymnastic, musical, and theatrical shows occupied day and night. Engaging too much in these pursuits, Hephaestion, the young Adonis of the army, fell sick with a fever. He was loved by the king, as men of Doric race, like the Argives of Homer's time, or the young Spartans described by Plato, loved their friends, and his loss was the greatest sorrow of this kind in Alexander's life. It was on the 7th day of Hephaestion's illness, when the king was watching the contest of some boys in the stadium, that news was brought to him that his general was dying. He hastened to his bedside, but Hephaestion had passed away, and Alexander threw himself upon the corpse in an agony of grief. It was a long time before he could be dragged away, and he lay on the ground for 3 days, refusing food or the bath, and bewailing his dead comrade. Many thought his abandonment unkingly, but Alexander had modeled his character as far as he might on the character of Achilles, and this was the way Achilles had behaved upon the death of Patroclus. Like Achilles, Alexander shaved his head, and strewed his locks upon the tomb of his friend, and like Achilles, he revenged himself upon the authors of his friend's death, the physician and Asclepius. The physician was hanged, and the god's temple at Ecbatana razed to the ground, while the Cosaeans, who rebelled at this time, formed a convenient offering of a grand scale to the comrade's shade. Perhaps the tales of the extravagances of his sorrow owe something to popular invention. Universal mourning was, however, decreed in the empire, and £2,000,000 were spent on the pyre erected at Babylon. Little did Alexander imagine that the 3,000 players he engaged to perform in Hephaestion's honor would serve for his own funeral games. While Peucestus took the corpse to Babylon, Alexander, accompanied by Ptolemy, made his last campaign, in the depth of winter, against the revolted Cosaeans. The Persian kings used to bribe these wild tribes of the hills to the northeast of Susiana to leave the empire in peace, but Alexander drove them away from their strongholds forever in his 6 weeks' progress. As he turned his face southward toward Babylon, ambassadors met him from various nations of the west. His troops were awaited in fear by the Scythians, Iberians, and Celts of northern Europe and Spain, by the Etruscans, Bruttians, and Lucanians of Italy, by the Ethiopians and Carthaginians of Africa, and representatives from all these peoples appeared in Asia to seek his alliance. An untrustworthy tradition relates that Rome sent envoys, but we do not even know if the future conqueror of the world had heard of Alexander. The king then sent shipwrights to Hyrcania to build a fleet for exploring the Caspian, which he thought might turn out, as the Persian Gulf had, to be an arm of the ocean, for its northern shores were quite unknown. For himself, he was busily preparing the Arabian expedition. As Alexander approached Babylon, something occurred which damped the spirits of the army and was not pleasant to the king. The Chaldeans, the seers and prophets of Babylon, came out to meet him with the warning that his entry into the city would be fraught with the greatest disaster to him. Alexander replied with a scoffing line from Euripides, but consented when the Chaldeans prayed him that he would at least enter the city by the western gate. Like many another brave soldier, Alexander proudly believed in omens and portents, but it was considered cowardly by the best Greek and Roman leaders to retreat when the auspices were unfavorable. The king nevertheless turned about and advanced along the Euphrates, with the stream on his right hand, but coming to rough and marshy ground, over which it was impossible to proceed, he abandoned the attempt to reach the western gate. He had begun to wonder whether the Chaldeans were tools in the hands of a party who wished to keep him out of the city, or had been tampering with the funds which he had given for the building of temples. Belus, however, was far from being a solitary voice. Shortly before the death of Hephaestion, a Macedonian diviner had predicted his death, and the kings from the absence of a lobe on the liver of a sacrificial victim offered in reference to each. The same man afterward acted as diviner for Perdiccas and for Antigonus, and the same evil omen preceded the deaths of those commanders. Then again, when Calenus, an Indian philosopher who had accompanied Alexander back to Susa, persisted in ending his infirmities, and was burned alive in great state, he refused, before the assembled army, to say farewell to Alexander. He should soon meet and greet him, he said, in Babylon. Into the fatal city, with his face in an unlucky direction, Alexander entered in February or March 333 B.C., and for long it seemed as if nothing would happen. Ambassadors from Greece were given audience. They congratulated and crowned the king, and were allowed to take back to Greece all the objects which Xerxes had carried away, including the bronze statues of Harmodius and Aristogeiton, the Athenian liberators. Not only did the king find at Babylon the fleet of Nearchus, the hero of the hour, but there had arrived also Phoenician ships which had been taken to pieces and conveyed overland through Phoenicia to Thapsacus, there reconstructed and brought down the Euphrates to Babylon. Dockyards were built, and other vessels were made from the abundant cypress trees of Babylonia. A harbor large enough to hold 1,000 men of war was formed near Babylon. Phoenician purple fishers and multitudes of other seafaring men from that coast were brought over to the Persian Gulf, the shores of which were to be colonized with a nautical population, and it was believed would speedily equal Phoenicia in commercial activity. Few statesmen have shown the aptitude for remolding a nation that Alexander showed for remolding the world. His next step would have been to subjugate Arabia, whence there had come no embassy to seek his friendship. Various pilots were sent to coast Arabia until they arrived at Egypt, but all returned after cruising in fear for various distances along the Arabian coast. The tales of Araby still enjoyed too much credence in the Greek mind. Moreover, the fleets of that time had no idea of provisioning for any long period, and so dared not proceed far along the shore of the Arabian desert. They must by this time have got from the natives some idea of its extent. Alexander was now to leave Babylon for a short time, and as nothing had yet happened to him, he was persuaded that the oracles of Bel had been terrifying him vainly. The business that drew him away was the affair of the Palacopus Canal. This canal had been constructed to receive the overflow of the Euphrates after the melting of the Armenian snows in the springtime. But when the river sank back into its bed, the purpose of the canal was served, and there was a danger of the drying up of the stream. The water had therefore to be turned back from the canal into the river, a task which sometimes occupied 10,000 Assyrians for 3 months. Alexander had determined to bestow a great boon on his Asiatic subjects. He readily discovered that if the canal joined the river at a different point, the water could easily be sent back into its channel, and he now set the work going. He then sailed down the canal toward Arabia and established a new and strongly fortified Alexandria in that direction, colonizing it with outworn veterans and such Greek mercenaries as were willing to stay. He returned to Babylon lighter at heart than he had been for some time, but a new evil omen befell him before he entered the city. As he sailed through the marshes by the tombs of the old Assyrian kings, a gust of wind blew into the water his broad-brimmed hat, and his fillet fell on a reed. These were evil signs in themselves, but worse followed. A Phoenician sailor leaped into the water and seized the fillet, and to avoid wetting it, swam back with it on his own head. The sailor received a double reward, a talent for his service, and a scourging for assuming the royal headdress. Legend says that it was Seleucus, the greatest of Alexander's successors, who thus secured the fillet. But the symbol did not fit so exactly. All that men thought at the moment was that a very bad portent had befallen the king. At Babylon, Paeocestus and other commanders with new levies awaited Alexander. The new soldiers were drafted into the Macedonian ranks, and reviews of the fleet and naval tournaments were held on the river. One day, when engaged in military arrangements, for he was making some fundamental changes in the art of war at the moment of his death, Alexander, feeling thirsty, left the room. His council, sitting on couches with silver feet round the great king's throne, rose as he rose, and attended him. And during their absence a man of low condition walked through the line of eunuchs who guarded the throne and sat down on it. By Persian law he might not be touched in that sacred place, and the horror-struck officials stood watching him while they rent their garments and beat their breasts. Alexander also was enraged when he returned, for in the East the thing seemed most evil, and the man's motive was eagerly sought, but even torture elicited no other answer than that it came into his mind to do it. A few days later Alexander gave a banquet at which Nearchus was the guest of honor, and all drank far into the night. The king wished to withdraw at one point, but his new intimate, Metius the Thessalian, successfully pressed him to go to a further feast at his own house. Here they continued to revel, and on the following night Metius continued the feast. Again they roistered far into the night, and after a bath and a little food, Alexander slept at the house of Metius, as he already felt a little feverish. He was carried out on a couch in the morning to make the sacrifices according to his daily custom, and then lay down in the banqueting hall at the palace until dusk, issuing orders for the great expedition southward on which he had been about to start. The foot soldiers, he commanded, were to leave on the 4th day, and he himself would sail with a fleet on the 5th day. He was carried on a couch to the brink of the Euphrates, and in a boat to the royal park. On the following day he again bathed and offered the sacrifices, lay down, chatted with Metius, ordered the officers to meet him at daybreak, ate a little and went to bed, only to toss all night with fever. All these details of the last days of the conqueror's life were preserved in the court diary, now lost, but used by early historians. On the following day Alexander directed that the fleet should be ready for the 3rd day, and bathed and sacrificed, and this he did the next day, but became worse in the evening, and on the following day was conveyed to the house near the swimming bath, where he could better carry on his priestly rites. The day after he could scarcely be borne out to the sacrifices, but he heard Nearchus's narrative of his voyage, and attended carefully to his maritime observations, for he still issued orders for the new voyage, apparently not recognizing until the end that his course was finished, that the only voyage awaiting him was the one for which the halfpenny fare would be put in his mouth. On the following day he was carried back into the palace, and the officers were summoned, but although he knew them, he was speechless, and for the 2 following days and nights tossed in a high fever. When they heard that he was no longer able to speak, the Macedonians came to the palace gates and forced their way into the room where he lay, to find out if he were dead, and if it was being hidden from them, or to see him once more if he lived. As they marched one by one past his bedside, he greeted each with his right hand, raising his head with difficulty, and making a sign of recognition with his eyes. Python, Seleucus, and others went to the temple of Serapis to inquire if they should bring him there. But the god answered that they should not remove him, and on the evening of the 13th of June, 323 B.C., he died. Extraordinary scenes of mourning followed in Babylon, and not only his Macedonian subjects, but all the peoples of its empire recognized that there had passed away one of the greatest men who have walked this earth. Some years later the story arose that Alexander was poisoned with poison procured for the purpose by Aristotle and sent to Babylon by Antipater by means of his son Cassander, while his younger son, Iollas, the royal cupbearer, actually administered it. Others thought that Metius and Iollas carried out the deed. There is nothing very improbable in the idea of Alexander being poisoned. Some of the best kings have been assassinated, and it was a normal fate for a Macedonian ruler. Nor are we in a position to say that Antipater and his sons or Metius would not have done such a deed if it had suited their own ends. It was one of the times in which such things are freely and naturally done. Modern doctors, however, have agreed that Alexander's symptoms were not those of poisoning, but of malaria. It must, in any case, have been a very slow poison, and had he taken it, Alexander's body could hardly have remained free from corruption for 7 days, as we were told it did. Indeed, It is said it underwent no change before it was embalmed. His body, taken to Egypt, according to his wishes, by Ptolemy, was ultimately placed in his city of Alexandria. Tradition relates that the companions asked the dying king to whom he left his scepter, and that he replied, "To the best man." His ring he had left with Perdiccas. A wit invented a sarcastic prophecy of Alexander's, to the effect that he knew there would be a great funeral contest held in his honor, meaning the year-long wars of his successors for his realms. End of section 12. Chapter 13 of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. Alexander's character and place in history. Arrian concludes his Anabasis of Alexander with an excellent summary of his qualities. He was of distinguished beauty of person. He was devoted to work, active in mind, heroic in courage, more so than professional bravos, remarks Curtius, fond of danger, tenacious of honor, steadfast in keeping agreements, strictly observant of his duty to the gods, of perfect self-control with regard to the pleasures of the body. For Aristobulus asserted that, though he used to hold long drinking parties, it was not for the purpose of enjoying the wine, but for the mildest conviviality. He always saw what ought to be done, and understood a situation at a glance, and was not liable to be taken in by impostors. He was very skillful in marshalling, arming, and ruling an army, and renowned for his power of rousing the courage of his soldiers. He always forestalled his enemies. Arrian judged that in the things of the mind Alexander was only insatiable of praise. He committed many errors from the quickness of his temper, but allowances were to be made for his youth, his uninterrupted success, and the evil advisers that always strive to corrupt kings. Moreover, Alexander was the only ancient king of whom repentance, due to his nobility of character, was recorded. Tracing his origin to a god was perhaps a device to make his subjects show him reverence, nor did he seem less renowned than Minos, Ajax, Rhadamanthus, and others who had done the same. It was merely a Greek national failing. His assumption of the Persian dress was a political device. Let the detractor, says Arrian, in words that are as useful for life as they are for historical criticism, perhaps more so, turn his eyes on himself, and consider on what petty objects he spends his own life, not affecting them, petty as they are. Arrian never seems to consider the chief point that arises in the modern mind. The modern question has become, what was Alexander's excuse for troubling the world? He has sometimes been considered as a vulgar freebooter, who did mischief enough to be called a great man, sometimes like a madman, the madman who destroyed the temple at Ephesus, crazed by his vanity. His invasion of Asia has been treated in this light, and the Macedonian subjugation of Greece has often been regarded as if it were analogous to Turkish rule there. It is only in the last few decades that justice has been done to Alexander as a man and a statesman, although in 1857 Freeman raised an eloquent voice for him. His vindication depends on the motives which underlay his actions, since he did not live long enough for those actions to justify themselves. And it seems probable that Philip and Alexander understood the political situation of Greece better than we can do after the lapse of over 23 centuries, and that if they considered the unification of Greece and the conquest of Persia a political necessity, it was one. At the worst, it was one for Macedonia. Alexander especially had a grasp of a situation given to few mortals. People are fond of representing Persian power as in its decline when he led his army over the Hellespont, but Alexander considered Persian soldiers as good as Greeks. After his conquest was completed, he enrolled the so-called effeminate Asiatics in his choicest regiments in place of veteran Macedonians, and informed them that he had found them in every way equal to his best and bravest fellow countrymen. It was merely training and leadership that they required, and Philip and Alexander probably realized that if another Cyrus or Darius the Great arose in Persia, Macedonia and Greece would become at one blow a Persian satrapy. It was all very well for the southern Greeks to sit secure, but Macedonia had known the disgrace of Persian conquest. Greece, moreover, was no longer the country which had repelled Darius and Xerxes at Marathon and Salamis. The ease with which she was overrun by the Macedonians demonstrates her danger from any strong and determined foe. It was decided, therefore, to choose this moment when the Persian Empire, weakened by years of internal dissension and now under no outstanding leader, was vulnerable, and crush it under the heel of Greece. An invasion of Greece by Persia might never have taken place, but other great peoples were to pour over Greece. The political prophet had looked far enough forward. He might have seen the Celtic inroads of the 3rd century B.C. and the Roman domination of the 2nd century B.C. Macedonia, thanks to Philip and Alexander, was some bulwark against the Celts, although Alexander's early death was fatal to the work which Macedonia had started. As to Macedonian destruction of the Greek city-state system, and with it the best life of Greece, Athens herself had twice wronged this institution by the formation of empires, and other Greek cities had established federations in which they tampered with individual independence. Pericles, prime minister in the day of Athens' greatness, bade her preserve her empire at whatever cost of injustice toward these cities over which she tyrannized. Nor had Athens sinned only against the city-state. Her democracy had often shown itself unworthy of its great citizens. Nor in the time of Philip and Alexander were her citizens so great as they had been. At the worst, the Macedonians seem to have hastened the end of what was in its decline. From our modern vantage point, we see that the nation was bound to come, that it needed a foreign invader at the gates of Thermopylae to bring about any concerted action in Greece, and that unity from within meant too long a process for the world to wait. Again and again the brilliant peoples of Greece had refused to submit to each other's hegemony, so at last the yoke was imposed by one whom they considered a foreigner. The strong Macedonian state which Alexander and his father established on the north of Greece saved Greece from barbarian conquest until the Romans were ready to take the place of Macedonia as protectors of civilization. Through Alexander's journeys, early Christian literature was enriched with Greek thought, and Christianity spread over the world more quickly through his work. He was a great cosmopolitan influence, the first in history, and despite the strangeness of the idea to the men of his time, he did not labor entirely in vain to unite East and West. To his Egyptian province we owe much of our knowledge of the Greeks. He is the link between the modern and the ancient world, the hinge on which European history turns, as well as a brilliant figure in the pageant of history. No sooner was Alexander the Great dead than his romance began to be spun. Indeed, his life as it stood constituted both romance and history. From the romantic point of view, it is a story of wars and wanderings that make it a second Iliad and Odyssey, of which Alexander is the Achilles and Odysseus. If there had been a second Homer, as Alexander sometimes vainly wished, to sing of this greater attack on Asia, he would have found many points of resemblance in his new hero to the best of all the Greeks. The characters of the Iliad always enter with some descriptive epithet, such as white-armed Hera, Menelaus of the loud war-cry, and Alexander, the swiftest runner of his time, would have been the new fleet-footed Achilles. His obstinate seclusion at the Hyphasis and at Opus on the 2 occasions when the army revolted compare poorly with the long sulking of Achilles in his tent, but the wrath of Alexander fell little short of the wrath of Achilles. In the year of the conqueror's death, when his great friend Hephaestion fell sick and died, the revenge which Alexander is supposed to have taken and the funeral celebration he arranged recall Achilles' dragging of Hector round the walls of Troy and the funeral pyre of Patroclus. This, although his successors and the Romans studied Alexander's doings as matters of importance to every general and administrator, the story of his life soon seemed to most people no more than a tale. Already by the 2nd century of the Christian era, the Greeks had created the romance of Alexander, which was very speedily translated from Greek into Latin, and from Latin into all medieval tongues. With the Roman de Troyes, the story of Alexander formed the chief part of the French classical cycle of medieval romances, among which are the famous Les Romans d'Alexandre, from which the term Alexandrines in prosody takes its name, and La Romane de toute chevalerie, the parent of the English king, Alexander, is a rougher and cruder precursor of Spenser's Faerie Queene. In this wonderful fairy story, King Philip sat in his hall among earls and barons all, and dubbed Alexander knight. In the wilds of the East, a palmer brings Alexander a herb to heal the sickness of his army. It was an angel, so saith the book, that the king the herb took. Finally Alexander and Porus, wandering over plains, dales, wildernesses, and mountains to the world's end, come to paradise, guarded by dragons, where God Almighty, through his grace, formed Adam our father that was. To consummate this entire neglect of any historical background in Alexander's story, the poets picture him, with the consent of his barons, intending to attack Germany, France, England, and Ireland, when he was diverted by a providential monster. With the Renaissance, however, all these delightful ideas about Alexander took their wing. It was some centuries before the romances were to be read again, and when at last they did come back, it was that they might be read for their own sakes, rather than for their historical value. But until this day, men have been occupied in getting rid of the legendary matter that still, in spite of every effort, clings to his name. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. The Alexandrian Empire. When news of the king's death was borne out of the sick-room, the ancient palace, built by Nebuchadnezzar's slaves and trodden by so many mighty kings since his time, was filled with the sound of mourning. But gradually a deep silence fell on the great generals and statesmen who, at the dead king's orders, had taken up their quarters there. Each began to ponder on what would befall next. Who would govern the earth in the place of the monarch who had just passed away? If any of them had already cast their eye on the supreme rule, they must have been planning in the deepest anxiety the next move in the game. The common soldiers remained under arms all through the dark night, no one daring to light a torch, and when eventually the bodyguards called the generals to a council, the soldiers all crowded round and tried to force their way in, determined on knowing their future fate. In vain a herald summoned those not invited to retire. An eager crowd of plebeian Macedonians thronged to the door of the great hall in which the important dignitaries had met to decide the fate of the empire. Perdiccas, therefore, caused the throne to be carried out of the palace and placed in full view of the assembly, and on it were displayed the diadem, royal robe, and armor. To this little heap he added the ring which the king had given him, and then turned to the multitude hanging breathlessly on his movements. "I restore to you," he said briefly, "the ring which the king used to seal his commands, and which he delivered to me. No greater misfortune can ever be sent us by the gods than the one we have suffered. But the gods only lent a man like Alexander for a short space, and his fate accomplished, they have carried him back to his own race. Since nothing is left to us but his mortal remains, let us pay what honor we can to his dust and name. But let us not forget that business of the most urgent nature awaits us. We need a head, whether one or more is for you to decide." All the generals then declared their opinions on the succession, and a stormy meeting followed. Perdiccas and the greater number wished to wait for the birth of Alexander's child by Roxanne, and if it was a boy, accept him as king. This child was Alexander Aegis, born a few months later. Nearchus, however, had a suggestion to make which stirred up the most violent anger. He proposed that Heracles, the son of Alexander and Barsine, a Persian woman, but not his new wife, the daughter of Darius, should receive the kingship. The crowd raised a great clamor of disapprobation, striking their lances on their shields, and Nearchus's proposal seemed so monstrous to nearly all his colleagues that the affair threatened to lead to blows. Ptolemy then raised his voice. Perhaps he had already a design on a throne, and wished to stir up popular feeling against the whole royal house. "Does the issue of either Roxanne or Barcine," he said, "seem worthy to rule over the Macedonian people? Could we mention their base names, those of slaves in Europe? Why did we conquer the Persians, if we are to obey their descendants? Darius and Xerxes, at the head of thousands of soldiers and with enormous fleets, in vain sought to bring us such servitude. Let us place the throne in the palace, hold a council, vote for our future ruler, and abide by the voice of the majority." This speech fell flat, and the majority had declared for the plan of Perdiccas, when somebody called out that Alexander had bequeathed his throne to the best man, and by giving his ring to Perdiccas had pointed out Perdiccas as the best man. This was greeted with enthusiasm by the crowd, who called to Perdiccas to take the ring again, but it did not commend itself to the nobility. The Macedonian army must vote on the matter. Meleager declared menacingly, and a common soldier called out that Alexander's half-brother, Arrhidaeus, should be elected. Meleager, who was a demagogue, took up this idea, and the army elected this youth with the title of Philip III. Perdiccas and Ptolemy thereupon departed from the city, taking with them nearly all the companion cavalry, who had not recognized the new king, wasted the surrounding country, and threatened Babylon with famine. Philip Arrhidaeus made a sorry king after Alexander, and the soldiers were absorbed in sad reflections when fresh disasters happened. The foreign population of the surrounding country, in a dangerous temper, through the ravaging of their lands by the cavalry, flocked into the city, which could not feed its own mouths, and threatened the Macedonians. They fell to quarreling among themselves, and the young king, unable to cope with the situation, begged them with tears to take the kingship from him. An embassy was sent to Perdiccas, and he returned, but he did not trust Meleager and his party, and caused 300 of them to be trodden under foot by elephants in presence of the whole army. This was the beginning of a deep feeling of hatred toward Perdiccas. For the moment all seemed well, but the Alexandrian Empire was not yet consolidated, and soon toppled over like an uncompleted building. In 323 B.C., the first partition of the empire was made in Babylon, and although the generals among whom it was divided were at first nominally ministers of the Macedonian king, they were practically independent, and from their viceroyalties 3 permanent kingdoms were ultimately evolved: those of the Seleucidae in Asia, the Ptolemies in Egypt, and a new Macedonian kingdom. The history of the last kings of the old royal house is briefly told. Philip Arrhidaeus, the simple tool of a faction of the nobility, was murdered at the instigation of Olympias in 317 B.C. The aged Olympias and her young grandson, Alexander Aegis, were murdered by Cassander, son of Antipater, in about 310 B.C., and with the murder of the conqueror's son, Heracles, by Polyperchon, the rival of Cassander, in 309 B.C., the royal Heraclid line of Macedonia came to an end in the male line. By the settlement of 323 B.C., the king was nominally supreme ruler, with Perdiccas as regent and Seleucus as his assistant or chiliarch. Antipater, still in Macedonia, and Craterus, who had now arrived there, were to continue and control of Macedonia and Greece. Ptolemy was to be satrap of Egypt and Macedonian Libya. Lysimachus was to rule over Thrace and the neighboring districts of the Euxine, soon to be overrun by the Celts. Antigonus and others divided Asia Minor. Python had Media, while the existing satraps were left in Sogdiana, Bactria, the Punjab, Gedrosia, etc. Antipater, although nearly 80 years of age, was very angry that Perdiccas and not he should have received the chief position in the empire, and speedily began to intrigue with Ptolemy and Antigonus against him. But Perdiccas was soon removed from the great scramble, being murdered by his soldiers in 321. A second arrangement was then made by which Antipater became regent, while Seleucus was appointed viceroy of Babylonia. Antipater, however, died 2 years later, having bequeathed the regency to Polyperchon, not, as would have been more natural, to his own son Cassander. This caused a war which resulted in Cassander defeating his rival, clearing all claimants to the throne out of his path by murder, and ultimately assuming the title of king. He made Macedonia his headquarters, and exercised practically uncontested rule there. He married Thessalonica, half-sister of Alexander the Great, and built Salonika, which he named after her. With his accession, Macedonia relapsed from its position as head of an empire, and became a simple kingdom again. The house of Antipater ruled over Macedonia until 295 B.C., when it was overturned by Demetrius, son of Antigonus. From 277 to 149 B.C., the Antagonids reigned, and in 149 B.C., Roman intervention culminated, after the Battle of Pydna, in the annexation of Macedonia by Rome. Thenceforth, Macedonia was a Roman province. After the death of Perdiccas in bitter wars, Antigonus, whose descendants were to rule in Macedonia, made himself predominant in Asia, and threatened Cassander in Macedonia and Ptolemy in Egypt. Seleucus, whom he drove out of Babylonia, took refuge with Ptolemy, and a general coalition was formed against Antigonus. In 312 B.C., Seleucus was restored to his rule, and in 301 B.C., Antigonus, aged 81, was defeated and slain at Ipsus. He had been the first of the successors to assume the title of king in 306 B.C., and it was in imitation of him that Cassander, Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Lysimachus promptly did the same. After the death of Antigonus, Lysimachus was the chief opponent of Seleucus in Asia, and Lysimachus too was slain in 281 B.C., leaving him without a rival, and he soon established his rule from the Aegean Sea to the Jaxartes and Indus. He founded the great dynasty of the Seleucidae, who maintained Greek influence in the East for over 2 centuries. Their realm was not equivalent to the Asiatic kingdom of Alexander the Great. India never permitted Greek troops to recross her streams, and Bactria and Sogdiana asserted their independence in a few generations after the death of Alexander. Asia Minor and other provinces gradually fell away. The great power of Parthia arose in the north, and only Syria remained to Antiochus the 13th, the last Seleucid king, when the Romans annexed his realm in 64 B.C. Still, for a long period, the Seleucidae had held up the torch of Greek civilization in Asia. The Romans then took up the cosmopolitan work of Macedonia, and the West gained infinitely by this continuous contact with the East. Greek continued to be spoken in those distant countries, and became the commercial tongue and the common language of educated people in the Roman world of that day. The Romans, although they despised the Greeks of their own time, took all their notions of literature and art from Greece, and were prepared to listen to a new religion which came to them in a Greek dress. Apart from any other gain to the world spirit, the Hellenism of Asia helped the spread of Christianity. From the first there was an important exception to the Seleucid rule in Asia Minor, and that was Pergamum. This place, which Lysimachus had made his capital, developed into an independent state, of small extent, but a brilliant center of Hellenic culture right down to Roman times. We are all familiar with its name from the fact that it has become corrupted into our parchment, which was manufactured there in the days of its greatness. The last king of Pergamon bequeathed his kingdom to Rome in 133 B.C. The third of the 3 larger kingdoms which rose in the Alexandrian Empire was that of the Ptolemies, whose base was in Egypt. Egypt, with which the Ptolemies very soon learned to be satisfied, abandoning extravagant pretensions to the whole Macedonian Empire, retained its independence of Rome longer than either Macedonia or the kingdom of the Seleucidae, though it came ultimately to the same end. It was founded by Ptolemy, son of Lagus, one of the most distinguished of Alexander's generals, and his biographer. And, besides firmly establishing a great kingdom, Ptolemy commenced its literary glory, probably founding the most famous library of the world at Alexandria, and making his court there a center of light and learning. The wealth of India and Arabia flowed into Alexander's great city, and the most brilliant men of the last period of Greek intellectual influence, the Hellenistic age, gathered together in the court of the Ptolemies. Rome took advantage of the quarrels of the last members of this house to interfere in Egypt, and on the death of the last sovereign of the line, Cleopatra, in 30 B.C., this wealthy and famous realm also became a Roman province. At the coming of the Romans, Greece followed the fate of Macedonia and was, despite its political insignificance, the most important conquest the Romans ever made, both from the point of view of their own intellectual development and that of the many nations of whom they were to be the teachers. We have said little about its history since Alexander made his final descent upon it in 335 B.C. The yoke of Macedonia had been an extremely light one, but the Greeks were unhappy under it. Sparta alone had refused to submit to Alexander, and when he had departed to Asia, its king, Agis, started to preach a crusade against Macedonia. Demosthenes was overjoyed and longed to help him, but Athens would take no part in the rising. Alexander heard of it and laughed at the Battle of Myce in Arcadia. Agis was slain, and his party was crushed by Antipater, whom Alexander had left in charge of Macedonia. Demosthenes was a great hero in Athens at this time, for although the citizens were little more inclined to follow his advice than they had been in the old days when he warned them against King Philip, they recognized that whatever he had predicted had come true. Sadly enough, he was to end an honorable life in a tragic way and leave a stain on his name. When Harpalus, Alexander's treasurer, fled from Asia at Alexander's return from India, he bore his stolen gold to Greece, calculating on being able to buy protectors, even if no one would help him out of ill will toward Macedonia. When he arrived at Athens, with 700 talents still remaining to him, the party of prudence at first carried the day against those who were frankly for taking the money. It seemed too risky to have anything to do with this object of Alexander's wrath. Covetousness, however, prevailed in the end, and the citizens were persuaded to vote that Harpalus should be arrested and detained until Alexander returned to Greece, and that his money should be placed for safety in the public treasury. The next thing that the people knew was that Harpalus had mysteriously disappeared, and that half the money had gone from the treasury. There was at once a great outcry against Demosthenes, who had had chief control of the matter. After making an impressive speech against having anything to do with Harpalus, it was said that he had been led by a heavy bribe to change his mind. He was followed about the streets and interrupted in his speeches by hooting, jeering crowds, and at last the matter was brought before the court of the Areopagus, noted throughout Greek history for its just judgments. By this great court, Demosthenes was declared innocent of bribery, but responsible for the disappearance of the money from the treasury. He was sentenced to pay the enormous sum of 50 talents, and being unable to do so, was thrown into prison. The severity of this punishment was no doubt partly owing to a desire to curry favor with Alexander, who might be expected to return to Greece at any time. He escaped, probably like Harpalus, by connivance, and bitterly upbraided the great city which had reared him as he stole away. "O Athenia," he cried, "what is it makes you take delight in 3 such noxious beasts as the owl, the snake, and the people?" Then came the news of Alexander's death, which seemed to the Greeks too good to be true. There had been many false reports which they had believed only too readily, and now that the event had actually befallen, it found them skeptical. Alexander had come to seem lifted above mortal chances and changes, and they expected at least that his death would be preceded by fearful portents. The orator, Demades, said that he could not be dead, or the whole world would have smelled of his corpse. They waited until the report was confirmed in the most definite fashion, and then they rose in revolt against Macedonia, as they had done on the death of Philip 13 years before. Demosthenes once more roamed over Greece, preaching a new fight for freedom. Athens pardoned him, not remitting the sentence of the sacred Areopagus, but giving him money to pay his fine, and he re-entered the city amid scenes of the wildest enthusiasm, every house being emptied of its inhabitants to meet him. It was a short-lived happiness. Antipater and Craterus marched south from Pella, defeated the Greeks at Cranon in 322 B.C., and were approaching Athens when Athens hastened to submit. Demosthenes had often raised a jeer when he had mentioned Marathon and Salamis to his fellow citizens, and now an outsider might have smiled at the efforts of the orator, who sought to kindle the old fire in them. Without striking a blow, they agreed to receive a Macedonian garrison into Attica, and to put to death the orators who had stirred up the revolt. Demosthenes and his fellows managed again to escape, but this time the officers of Antipater were on their track. They separated, therefore, the better to elude them, and Demosthenes took refuge in the temple of Poseidon in the island of Caloria. The Macedonian captain who had charge of the pursuit crossed in a light vessel with some Thracian spearmen, and tried to lure Demosthenes from his sacred asylum. Antipater, he said, meant him no harm. Demosthenes, knowing full well what were the Macedonian intentions with regard to him, replied by requesting the captain to wait a while and allow him time to write a letter to his family. Then he withdrew into the temple, took a scroll and a reed pen, put the reed into his mouth, and chewed it pensively, as was his custom when composing. After a while he bowed down his head and covered it. "Look at that coward!" the soldiers exclaimed impatiently, and again bade him fear nothing from Antipater. The orator, however, uncovered his head, and showed the Macedonians that he was dying, having used the brief delay to drink poison from his pen. He strove to totter out of the temple, so that he might not pollute it by his death, but staggered and fell lifeless before the altar. They raised a bronze statue to him in Athens, where his end was considered glorious, and inscribed on it that if his might had equaled his wisdom, Macedonia would never have conquered Greece. Antipater practically abolished the democratic institutions of Athens, and reduced her to slavery indeed. But the continued wars of Alexander's successors and the invasions of the Celts into Macedonia allowed the Greeks gradually to win back their independence. The famous Achaean and Aetolian leagues, formed for this purpose, had great histories. But these Greek federations came too late, and Greece was soon at the feet of a new master. Under the Romans, Athens won a new importance, not political, but literary and artistic, and once merely the school of Hellas became the school of Rome and of the world. End of chapter 14. End of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell.